is the most awful coffee I've ever had.
Right, shall we come to order then? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Belated Happy New Year. I think you all know the business we're focusing on this morning, but we'll go through the formalities and then try and get through this today. Minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of November. You all happy with those? I think your point's on the 6th of December, David. Let's just deal with 30th November. Are you happy with that? And then minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of December.
On the top of page 20, Chairman, I did raise at the time, it is minuted here, my concern about the lack of clarity of the plans that we were presented with, and I asked for a better plan to be provided. I have actually put that in writing as well, but it hasn't.
And you haven't had it
come through yet.
Okay,
Yeah,
I will ask the officers to make sure you get that. Okay. Otherwise, we're all happy with the minutes. Yep. Okay. Question time. Not aware of any questions. Not aware of any item 4 questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3. To advise the Chairman there are no urgent items. Declarations of interest. Now take the standard declaration in relation to members that are double-hatted, district councils. Are there any other declarations? And a parish council. Okay, we'll take that. Any other declarations? No. Declarations of the party whip. There are none. Presentation of petitions, item 8. I'm not aware. Well, there isn't a petition. Now, I admitted just to say we do have a few substitutions today, and it is a little complicated. So, just for record, we have Mr. Bolter for Mr. Charlesworth. We have Mr. Parton for Mr. Morgan. Is that correct? Mr. Pearson is unable to be here. I think he's got health issues. He was here, he's had to leave. And Mr. Wyatt also has family issues, and he's asked me to give his apologies. No other substitutions? No. Okay. So that then takes us to item 9, which is the development of the unitary structure. We're going to pick up where we left off before Christmas. I'm just going to go straight into this because I think the key issue that we want to focus on this morning is financial issues, which we haven't yet gone into in any detail. And we've got the correct officers here to go through that with us. And then we're going to look at, we're going to revisit in a bit more detail key issues that had come out previously around the area committees and the planning governance, and then we'll have a break for lunch. So we do of course have Nick Rushton, leader of the council, with us again, and deputy leader Byron Rhodes. I've got no further comments to make before we go into financial options. Is there anything you wish to say as an introduction, Nick?
No, Simon. Thanks for inviting me again. Just to let you know, I do need to leave at the latest 2:30, although Byron is willing to stay for the duration.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we should try and finish as soon as we can after that. We'll see how it goes. Okay. You don't wish to make any introductory statement?
No, I don't think so, Simon.
Okay. Nothing's changed over Christmas.
No, it's your meeting and we're here to answer your questions.
Right. Byron, anything you want to say at this point, or can we go into the financial options?
Very happy for you to continue.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we have Chris Tambini, Director of Corporate Resources, and Declan Keenan, Assistant... No, you're Director of Finance, aren't you? That's right. I do get confused sometimes with these titles, but okay. Who would like to kick off on the options appraisal?
I'll kick off. So we're going to do it as a bit of a presentation. So within the pack, there's quite a detailed kind of options appraisal around the finances. I think this is the second time we've had it, so hopefully you had a chance to read it. I'm going to talk a little bit around the financial position of the county council, district councils and the wider public sector. And then Declan will take us through some of the details within the actual options appraisal. So that's the agenda. So in terms of, I suppose, the financial position faced by the County Council, I expect everybody's pretty familiar with this. So I'm just going to rush through it really. The MTFS we published before Christmas had the requirement for £74 million worth of savings within it. There were 34 million which are identified within the MTFS. There's a 20 million gap, and there's £20 million worth of savings around SEN. That gets you to the 74 million. If you look back over the last kind of 10 years or so, we have had a pretty successful track record in terms of delivering savings. But I have to admit, it is getting harder. It's getting harder technically to deliver the savings. And actually, there's less in the way of cuts that can be made, or particularly kind of legal cuts that can be made, as we're getting close to the kind of statutory level of services. The other thing that's kind of emerged over the last kind of 5 years or so is the real pressure around social care and SEN. That's both children and adults social care. So that is a particular issue for us. And I know members are familiar with that as well. We have sought to diversify a bit into generating income, both around the commercial and also kind of property investments as well. And that is making a bit of an impact, but it isn't going to sort our problem out because our problem is so huge. The final point on this slide is, I suppose, the uncertainty. We've got the comprehensive spending review next year. We've also got fair funding. The fair funding kind of review will kind of come to its end next year. And also we've got the changes around business rate retention. So there's a number of different things that will impact our local authority finance next year. I mean, I'm kind of hopeful that it could have a positive impact in terms of the county council finances, but I say there's a huge amount of uncertainty. But hopefully it will go our way. So in terms of the county council, we you know, familiar with it. We've got severe pressures. District councils, I think privately a lot of district treasurers, not just Leicestershire treasurers, but other treasurers would admit that they haven't had the pressure that counties have had. Even so, if you look at the MTFSs of district councils over the next 4 years, they've got £12 million worth of savings within them. And over the recent years, they haven't had the significant change programmes that we've had at the county council. We've got this sort of demographic pressures around social care. There are some demographic pressures for district councils, particularly around homelessness services and homes, and particularly in Leicestershire about the growing number of homes within the county area. I think the biggest issues for districts, I suppose, are things into the future. I talked about the CSR, fair funding, and the business rate retention. That could have quite a big impact in terms of district councils, particularly when it comes to the reset of business rates, where because there's been a lot of economic growth in Leicestershire, when they reset it, a lot of that money could be taken away from district councils as it could from us. But because the allocation of that money has been 80-20 in favour of district councils, it has a far bigger impact in terms of district council budgets. There have been some changes to new homes bonus already, but there's also the possibility that odd rumours go around that they might get rid of it, etc. I'll come back to that a bit later on. So in terms of, I suppose, the future, which I've talked about in terms of funding changes, probably the best case for the county council is that, you know, the government continues to ration resources, but does fund actually key pressures. And if you look at what's happened over the last few years, I suppose the government has thrown a bit of money at the prison service when there's been problems, has put some money towards the NHS when there's been some issues, and actually within this year's budget has actually given a significant amount of money to county councils because they're in a particular issue, and that's around kind of highways and social care monies. And I think if you look kind of forward over the next 5 years, that's probably the best we can hope for. There is a kind of a likelihood as well that we're going to have a recession. We're probably due a recession. We haven't had one for nearly 10 years. I know a number of forecasts are actually coming off the fence now and saying 2020 could be the year where there is a recession within the West. So again, that is a big risk for us. And I've mentioned the issues around kind of funding formula and particularly the impacts around district councils. In terms of fair funding, it looks like the funding formula is going to be predominantly based around population, and that could have a bit of an impact for some of our districts. Some could win, but I imagine some could lose from some of the modelling we've done as well. So again, that could up the pressure on some of those districts. Right. I don't know how I get this working. But some of you would have seen this before, but I kind of think this this animation kind of sums up the pressures for the county council, but also kind of sums up the pressures for the whole country in terms of the ageing population and the changing demographic. And it's oh, it started already.
Do you want me to go back?
Yeah, go back to the start. So what it means is it shows the pressures on our budget, but it also shows the fact that the government has got real issues. So they need to allocate money to the health service because of the demographics of the country. And what that means is there's less money for everybody else. So this is the demographics in 1950 to 2040. You can kind of see the years ticking through. And what it shows is the massive increase in the number of older people, which is is absolutely huge. So that's kind of where we've ended up, and a lot of that increase in terms of the blues. So the blues are kind of the 85 plus at the very top, and a lot of that increase is actually over the next kind of 20 years, and that's a huge pressure. So it'll impact directly on us, but it'll impact indirectly because more money will be going to the NHS and less to local government. I'm going to pause there and pass over to Declan, who will take you through the detail in terms of the business case.
What I was going to take you through is Chris touched on primarily around the savings. So it is based on the paper that was appended to sort of the...
Could you put your microphone on?
Oh, sorry. So as Chris mentioned, I'm going to primarily take you through based on the paper that was sort of provided to sort of scrutiny previous before Christmas and attached to today's papers. But I've tried to add in there any other bits and pieces that have come up as well. So there is a couple of sort of supplementary bits. And the first one is around this question of kind of, I suppose, basically unitary versus shared service, where are the sort of the financial benefits better? And that quote at the top kind of encapsulates almost why sort of the unitary council benefits are always going to be superior to what you get from a shared service. And what Drucker's sort of saying there basically is that you can put effort into making something more efficient, but you're still consuming resources to do that sort of, A, the improvement activity, and B, the actual performance. Whereas kind of the essence of the unitary sort of proposal is you eliminate certain activities, and primarily around the cost of being in business. Hence, it's kind of, you're always going to have that sort of better outcome in terms of that sort of pure sort of organisational efficiency through unitary. So the table headings there running down the left, the eliminate through to outsource, so just from a management consultancy toolkit. And the context to bear in mind here is the savings we're looking at are primarily management savings and overhead type savings. So just kind of working through those where they sort of see the differences. The eliminate touched on, you've got fewer organisations, hence you can eliminate that sort of any costs associated with just being in business. Similarly, the sort of the costs of working between the sort of the local government organisations within the county area. So that's something unitary delivered that a shared service wouldn't be able to. Simplifies, obviously kind of just simplifying the activities you do is possible in a shared service, but what the difficulty you get is sort of different organisations place different value on different things, hence you can't always get a consensus down to kind of a single process or a single approach, whereas it's much easier in that sort of one organisation context. Automate, again, it's sort of something that everybody's got access to, but what you tend to have if you've got bigger scale, you've got access to sort of the best solutions, as it were, so you can kind of justify that initial sort of upfront expense to get the benefits. So you can do it in a shared service, but it tends to be kind of a bit more fewer options. Standardise is the same as simplify, really, just a sort of obviously sort of slightly different. The consolidation line there, that refers to sort of management and location. The problem of this in a shared service environment tends to be that people like to control, but if you want to sort of do a true shared service, you've got to compromise. You tend to kind of get a bit of compromising in there, but also that additional governance layer on top of that operational management. So the interests of each organisation are still represented in the shared service, whereas obviously you bring it into one unitary authority or two unitary authorities, you do get the sort of that alignment of the organisation and the management of the individual operations. And the final one being outsourcing, and this is kind of almost the flip way around. The benefits tend to be less for a unitary council just because you've already got the bigger scale, but those would be sort of savings over and above what you'd kind of initially propose. So really what this sort of, I suppose, comes back to is just trying to sort of explain that with the unitary council, you're targeting those organisational level savings rather than individual sort of task or process efficiency savings. And with the shared service, you just don't have the same scope to access those sort of services, and it's much more difficult to implement because you've got sort of different people pulling in different ways. I should have mentioned actually, quite happy to take sort of questions as we go through because it's quite a long presentation, so realise you don't just want to be talked at. So.
I think you've invited that, David.
on the presentation so far. First of all, is that we seem to be heading into a recession, and I don't see why we should just assume we are going to head into a recession. I would hope that somebody somewhere is planning us to avoid this happening, rather than just saying it, because people are suffering now. The people on low incomes really have got problems across the county. And if we're just sort of glibly accepting, oh, well, we're going to go, this is the natural way, I don't think it should be the natural way. I think we should be helping to plan our way to protect people and to avoid to avoid what would be a calamity if people on low incomes are going to even be worse off. And I do wonder about that first line. Easier to agree, fewer compromises. With due respect to Nick, who I get on well with a personal level, I'm not so sure that fewer compromises is what we need in this county. I think compromise is what keeps us all together, with a variety of views coming together in hopefully a common cause. This idea that and I'm not having a go at you, Nick, it's just this thought that everything should be controlled by one person at the top, whether it's President Trump or President Putin. That isn't the kind of situation I want to live in. I want to live in a situation where we all have a say, and we do work together and govern by consent. So there are aspects of that which just I find difficult to accept.
Okay.
With all due respect to the officers, and I know the officers making the financial argument. But
where's this information come about a recession then? Because you seem to hint that it was something that would affect the whole of the West. So presumably this is an international forecasting, is it?
It is. There's a few commentators that come off the fence and just think there is a recession due probably 2020 onwards. When you've got the China-US kind of trade things, you've got Brexit. There's quite a few kind of risks out there, and a few people are kind of saying that there's going to be an economic slowdown. I mean, in terms of the impact of a recession, well, it's twofold. There's one around resources, but there's also around demands. Generally, when there's a slowdown, there's higher demands on county council services for the issues that you've mentioned. So the county council would have to react to it.
Causing a recession, and I hope that our people in Parliament who've been talking about this might just give it some thought, that we're making this assumption that Brexit is going to be a cause of recession. Shouldn't that be a cause for us to say, well, think again, folks?
Right, Declan, did you want to respond on what's the basis of that information you've got up then? Is this all a management information then that you've put together, or is this something you've put together, or is this drawn off from somewhere else?
It's a combination. So the framework is like I say, it's just a management consultant toolkit, but the population is something I've done, which is in truth it's across the whole of the presentation. I just wanted to pick back on that consensus point, because it's just important to remember the context of most of the savings through the unitary aren't the kind of the changing the service approach. We've tried to avoid that as much as possible. It's more about the kind of the back office and the overhead, the management. So they don't tend to be the type of choices that you'd normally go out to the public or get sort of even elected members involved. What's the best way to pay an invoice, how letting individual contracts. It's that kind of level of thing that this is trying to get at. It's not trying to get at that sort of undermining of that kind of democratic sort of overlay. So.
A helpful clarification. Right, I've got Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman. Just coming back to a point you made there, Declan, about that if you have one authority doing everything, you must get a better service, was the implication I understood of what you said. But if we just bring it down to things we do here, so dry waste disposal. Now, my understanding is since County took complete control of dry waste disposal, we now recycle less than the totality of the districts beforehand. So how is our system more efficient? Is it more efficient financially, but we put more waste into landfill? And if so, what are the figures on that? or is it that sometimes it's not more efficient?
You can stand that up, can you, that comment about, you've got some figures. They're available, are they? Okay, I think we'd like to see those at some point. Right, you want to respond?
I didn't make any comment about sort of the best service. The point I'm trying to make is you can leave the service level alone, but then you're trying to change these organisational overheads. So you're getting at that type of thing. So they kind of, whether you sort of, how you do that dry recycling is pretty independent from sort of a unitary type savings. It's more, like I said, I know I kind of repeating it, but it's more about the back office. It's more about the management. It's a separate choice what you do with the services themselves. I mean, in terms of the dry waste, like I say, it's kind of, you could keep a different setup, or you could go back to the original setup. It's completely different to that sort of local government reorganisation saving. Obviously, it was taken in a two-tier area. So just kind of, I suppose, bear in mind, this isn't trying to get at better service, worse service. It's just saying, actually, for the same level of service, you can organise yourself differently at an organisational level, and that's what we're trying to get at through the whole presentation, really.
Ted? Sorry.
Oh,
sorry. No, I apologise, Mrs.
Go on then, Brenda.
Come on. Thank you very much. Oh, could I just have that back up on the screen, please? Thank you very much. I'm trying to understand the value of what's on there to me, and I've written it down in one sentence, and from that, what that is telling me, it's telling me that shared services will be cost effective, but unitary would be easier to agree and compromise. So I don't know, I can't see from that the benefit. It's not shouting out at me the benefit of unitary compared to shared services. And obviously it is supposed to. But I can't really see it there, so I don't know what you were trying to get at with that whole thing. When it says consolidate and compromise, shared services have got a tick on everything except that consolidate and compromise. But surely shared services do that anyway as well.
It's a ticks, but with a caveat, because you do get a benefits from those areas, but the benefits are restricted compared to what you can do if you're trying to target the similar savings through a unitary setup. So that was trying to do the consolidate. Like I say, you've still got 8 different organisations trying to agree one thing. So you ultimately do get different preferences that compromise then a true shared service. It's very unusual to get 8 organisations completely aligned. And that's the point I'm trying to make.
I don't think we should get too hung up on this management tool. I've got Ted and then Terry, and then I think we need to move on. Ted?
Well, given what you've just said then, Chair, that this was going to be a quick comment anyway, but it is actually about this toolkit. So this is gleaned from a management consultant who has designed this template. The first point is, can we have a copy of it, please? Because it's something that, one would find useful to go away and study. And secondly, as a means of reassurance, could what you prepared today, these type of models, be almost given to another management company to be stress tested and say, well, from what you've written and what you've put in this tool, this would work, as a means of giving us the council extra assurance that this is viable and it would work?
Just on that second point, the intention is, as you is to develop these into a business case, you would get an external sort of independent party to do a sort of a assurance, like you say, that the sort of the savings proposal is reasonable, that it's not just it is grounded in something. So that will happen.
Terry?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with members opposite with concerns that this is a bit kind of high level and we need something that we can grasp that's local. And I guess I think the example we've got locally that I think would be I'd be interested to hear your views about how you would think about that using this box, is of course the light bulb project, which is a major shared service which is intended to produce better services for residents, but also be much more efficient in the back office, removing a lot of handoffs. So putting that, would you be able to put that into this box and tell me why it would be better if the light bulb were not a shared service but were a unitary service?
I'm probably not close enough to the sort of the specific light bulb project, but it would be around that sort of, I suppose, the things like the speed of implementation. Obviously, light bulb took a long time to kind of get in, so it is around that sort of satisfying lots of different organisations with to get to a similar goal. But you'd need someone who's much more au fait with that specific example than me, to be honest.
Right, Declan, press on.
There's too many things to remember. So questions being raised about sort of link between scale and financial resilience. So the chart up there is just unitary authorities, and just highlighted the ones, and it's issues in the press in 2018. So it's not just about Council X has got savings to make, but something a little bit different. And the chart just plots population against the funding level, and it does tend a little bit to be the sort of the unitaries with sort of smaller sort of scale of the issues. But to be honest, there's not enough highlight dots on there for it to be any sort of claim to be any sort of definitive sort of study. But the thing I'd sort of try and draw out from here is scale isn't the only factor. You'll see kind of on the vertical axis is funding level, and you can see it's a huge difference even for sort of councils with the same size of population. The funding difference is massive. It's almost double. But even on this, obviously only two-dimensional, you could have sort of deprivation or other rurality or other sort of factors of kind of service demand. But quality management often seems to be the thing that comes out to be the sort of the differentiator between organisations. But I mean, used properly, scale should help, but it's very difficult to do a very simple scale versus sort of financial resilience. Also use this as well because it'd been raised as a concern that sort of Leeds and Birmingham, the new sort of Leicestershire unitary, it'd be sort of somewhere here as kind of the third biggest unitary. But it's important to sort of realise the kind of although that's true from a population covered basis, in terms of the scale of the organisation, it's very different. Leeds' net budget is roughly twice the proposed unitary, and Birmingham is getting on for sort of 3 times the size. So they're still significantly different organisations. And I'll come back to sort of the county council scale in a minute because it's quite useful in a different context. But it is very difficult to fit the proposal of what we're doing here with existing unitaries because the funding levels and the sort of the type of organisations is very different. So what I tried to do was kind of trying to do that sort of similar comparison but in a different way. And you'll see the top box there, it just compares the unitaries to the 2 tiers, and you can see the kind of the average population is far less in existing unitaries than it is in the sort of the 2-tier areas. But also the core spending power, I mean, it's basically a good 10% better as well, so it makes it very difficult to compare the different sort of authority types. So to try and get things a little bit closer, what I did was pick the Society of County Treasurers, and the reason I picked that is it's just a group who choose to kind of come together, and it's pretty representative. It includes the ex-unitaries of sort of in the Bedfordshire's areas, Cheshire's, Northumberland, people like that, and also, but the only one it doesn't have is Durham. So it just felt a cleaner population, a cleaner comparator group. The core spending differences are much less, but there still is a population difference. So just sort of plotting on that, you can see almost, just because it's bigger, the kind of the funding range is much tighter. You've got 650 to 850 there, where it was about 650 to 1,000 there, despite having a much bigger population spread. These kind of authorities out here are serving a bigger population than Birmingham does. And just going back to that point of where the county council fits, this is the county councils, sort of the darker blue, and the sort of the greyer ones, these ones here are the county unitaries. If you were to just compare the county council, if I take education out just because schools skew things, Leicestershire is the 25th out of 27 county councils in terms of net budgets. We're pretty small, and the 2 that are smaller than us are Buckinghamshire and Dorset. So when they've converted, we're going to be, excluding education, the smallest county council. So hopefully it provides some assurance that kind of there is other organisations that successfully kind of I suppose, operate which much sort of bigger scale. And even if we were to convert to sort of the unitary proposal, the bigger of the two, the single one, we'd only be 19th on that list of 27. So we're not pushing the boundaries of how local government operates. It's kind of we're still kind of fairly small in truth in the scheme of things. So just after that brief detour, just going back to that sort of scale of versus resilience question. Again, did another sort of desktop study, and there's just take you through these from sort of, again, publicly available information. The BBC got all their reporters to have a bit of a look at where they saw the kind of the authorities in trouble in their area, and they did quite a decent article in truth on that, explaining them. There's also been kind of a lot of sort of authorities, again, not just sort of kind of they've got savings to make, but ones have had kind of serious issues, your Somerset kind of emergency and year cuts, that sort of things. The other category we looked at is who's been having reorganisation type discussions, and the final one was audit issues. And again, we all get this gets published, whether it's a value for money or just how we kind of put our financial accounts together. So we had a look at across the whole of this kind of, for all of these organisations, we looked at these different factors. And this is what we came out with. The unitary line was very clean and kind of surprisingly so in some ways. If you look at kind of the average populations, much lower, they're much sort of smaller organisations, but they're getting very few issues. You look at the two-tier area, it's fairly horrendous. You're getting into sort of a third of authorities are kind of having visible kind of issues from when you look externally. And in some ways it's illogical in truth, because kind of although the core spending power will help a bit, it's only a 5% difference. It shouldn't explain all this. But what being unitary does is it gives you the potential to be more efficient and effective as an organisation on that kind of how you can sort of direct your resources. You've got much more freedom to move your resources around. They're not tied up in overheads. And that's allowed the unitaries to overcome that sort of big scale disadvantage. So that's kind of the point trying to sort of show there, that it's becoming increasingly visible that the pressure on the two tiers are struggling to deal with similar pressures that their unitary counterparts can deal with. Just keeping the theme going, sort of just flick through a couple more slides before sort of pause for questions again. In terms of the diseconomies as well, it kind of that's a bit of a comparison between sort of county councils and unitaries, but just almost per se, where do we fit as a sort of a proposal? And this is sort of the Leicester Mercury, again, it's quite a good article. They do the sort of the top 200 of sort of biggest organisations based out of Leicestershire. And you can see there that sort of Leicestershire County Council, although it'd fit neatly in that sort of top 10 just, it's, the size of scale for Leicestershire is much lower than others. And it's not to try to say whether the local government organisation is the same, it's just a demonstration that organisations quite commonly do operate at a different sort of scale. And you can see that the new unitary, it's about 20-25% bigger than the current county council. It's not on a different order of magnitude, it's a bit bigger but not huge. And the fact as well that the proposal is about geographic areas, the same nature of business is very similar. It makes it a lower risk growth than you would in a lot of other ways, maybe if you were in a commercial way. But conversely, if you look down at the sort of the largest district, even moving from the largest district to the two unitary, that is a big jump. It's about a sort of 750% increase. You can see why the concerns come much more from the district level about kind of, is it too big? It's too much of a change. And it is, in truth, from a sort of it is a big change from sort of even the biggest district to move to a sort of half the unitary. But you can see the scale jump there is just much smaller. It's much easier to conceptualise what's going to happen. And then sort of taking us down from the sort of the organisation level more onto a sort of service level. Again, it kind of gives you a bit more comfort, because the key services, our big ones, the sort of social care ones, highways and transport, there's very little kind of increase in scale if you were to bring the different service types together just on this is how we do the sort of financial reporting, not necessarily how you'd organise things. There's very little difference there. It's the smaller services here that are proposed to get brought together. Sort of the blue bars is the combination of all the district spend, and the red ones being the existing county spend. So you see, we're not growing the bigger services. This is why sort of the regional sort of collaboration of adult social care isn't the first thing you'd naturally look at. It's bringing together the sort of the small scale services into one place. So if I pause there, that's all I was going to sort of say about sort of scale and diseconomies.
Ted, we will circulate all the slides. You don't need to take your own personal. We'll wait. I know you asked that question. I should have answered it, but we'll put them on the website as well. Okay. Sorry, Declan.
That's all I was going to say on the scale type aspect.
Right, Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman. Declan, can you just go back to the slide with... I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going. That's the one. That's the one. Couple of questions. Number one, Wiltshire's not on there, which surprises me since they come and spoken to us. But looking at the other two that have spoken to us in County Durham and Cornwall, and I know we've got examples that feature largely in the pack about Durham and Wiltshire. So, and I did ask this question before. So, when these councils started, they have a larger budget than us per head of population, and they have fewer residents, so considerably better funded. And therefore, their level of savings for all of those three authorities is considerably less than we've already saved as the Leicestershire County Council, brilliantly, with the superb work we've done here over that period. So we're holding those up as exemplars to say this 30 million saving is available, but surely what they should have saved is what we've saved, in fact more than we've saved, plus that 30 million on top, which they haven't. So what I'd be interested in having is a chart that actually showed their budgets, where they started from, what they've saved, to compare that against what we're actually projecting in our figures of savings, because we've already saved more than they've saved. So the implication is that those savings aren't available. If those areas that are far better funded with a lower population can't make those savings, why would we be able to?
So there's a couple of quick bits. The reason Wiltshire's just is on there, it's just not labelled. I think.
Oh, it's my eyesight.
No, it's not. You'll see there's a few, and I think it's that one there. It's just there wasn't. It was getting so cluttered with labels.
I forgot my reading glasses.
No. It's just a label that's missing. So not all of them are labelled because it was. If you look at it basically started off at life as that previous one. There's too many dots to label everything. And in terms of the saving question, I'll come on a little bit to sort of the comparison of this unitary proposal versus the other one. It is difficult to do that saving versus saving comparison because effectively what people do is they only save what they have to do. So you save within your funding envelope. So they none of them have particularly gone out as a sort of almost a kind of an ideological mission to just kind of save more and more. So it makes it difficult if you're kind of comparing everything over time from 2009 to now. There's too many different factors at play. You can do some of the stuff that you've touched on, but kind of that line by line saving is very different because we all present information in a very different way on that sort of public basis. So we can try and do bits, but it probably won't satisfy you completely just because the information we won't be able to get at it.
If I may come back, Mr. Chairman. So what you're actually saying is they could have saved more, but they haven't, because there's been no requirement for them to do it because of their budget. But the three leaders from all those councils actually sat here, either two in this room and one on a webinar, telling us they had struggled to make the savings they've already made, which is in contradiction to what you're saying about they could have made more. So who's right? So are the leaders of those councils right, or is our view that they could have made more savings right?
The example I'd probably pick is the Wiltshire one, where sort of there were their opening libraries and we're kind of tailing back on libraries. So it's those service choices that haven't had to make the same level of sort of service choice that we have. But you've also got, don't forget that, I suppose that point made before, there's so many other things going on that create service demand. It's very difficult to create that completely clean picture. But they all kind of will come on to a comparative of what the savings they actually make. But they did all achieve savings to the level that, or even in excess of the level that we're proposing here as well. So we'll come on to that shortly.
Bill Bolter.
Thanks, Chair. When this process started off, we said we wanted to see different authorities. We had those being relatively successful going unitary. We asked for those who weren't being so successful to come to speak to us. We've had nothing from them at all. Now, is the reason why they've not been invited to come and speak to us? Because we did ask that right at the very beginning. We need those who are successful and those who are struggling. It's not been carried out. So we've only had one side of the story. And to make a decision, we need both sides of the story. Because with respect, we're being led down a certain line, and we as members need to see the whole story, not a particular story that's being promoted by the Cabinet.
I think we did make some approaches to other authorities. Norfolk was one that was asked for. Nick, did you make contact, you. I mean, I think the problem here.
I
is
did
that-
try, Simon, but
yeah.
I think people that fail don't want to trumpet their success in failing.
Haven't had a positive response to invitations.
So the next question then, Chair, is how many authorities have gone down the unitary route have been successful? How many are struggling? How many have failed? Information is not before us. We've only got those who have actually succeeded in a relative degree. So we've only got half a story.
Does this come up in your presentation?
Now that was the point of sort of trying to make here, that the ones that sort of are given publicly sort of issues, as it were, that sort of well publicised are these ones. Actually, I put Poole and Bournemouth on there just because they've voluntarily gone into a unitary structure, but it's only Hartlepool, Torbay, Reading, Shropshire and Birmingham where kind of the issues are that obvious. It's kind of surfaced to the top, whereas if you look at the kind of the county side of things, there's far more, even though it's just a much smaller sort of population. You know, you're talking about a third of the counties, where it's kind of only about sort of 5% of the unitaries. So on that was the comparison we're trying to do. That kind of, from what we can see, and you can only obviously see what people choose to share. It's chalk and cheese in some ways. It's sort of the issues in a two-tier area are far in excess of the issues that unitary councils are experiencing at the moment. So you can keep looking, but it's only going to be that small number.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, so the next big pickup is that kind of comparison to other proposals. And when trying to do a sort of savings activity like this, you do try and take things from two perspectives. One is kind of, almost theoretically what should be possible. So the easiest place to start tends to be just looking at what's been achieved elsewhere. But then you also try and look at, well, what's the savings potential looking at local circumstances. This next bit of the presentation is very much on that first one, what's been achieved elsewhere. And kind of when you look at sort of different measures of why different savings are different in different business cases, it tends to be the key driver tends to be the number of organisations that have been abolished. And that kind of fits with the elimination of work theme, this kind of reduction of sort of the cost of being in business. Just one point to note, the Dorset one is slightly different on a two unitary one in that it's kind of, you've still got three upper tier authorities going down into two, so you do avoid some of the issues of organisational splitting. But as I say, you can see that it's fairly similar. We're aiming at 4.3 million per organisation abolished, which is kind of a similar order of magnitude to the other three. That said, these three are all in proposal stage at the moment, even though sort of the two have been given the go-ahead. So if we go back to kind of 2009 and see what happened there, and this is kind of, just bear in mind as well, this is before austerity started. So when the people were doing these business cases with the savings target, the pressure wasn't as big as it is now. So it's kind of part of the reason that the savings level on average is lower down at 3.5 rather than the 4 over the page. But part of it obviously is going to be inflation as well. We've had kind of 10 year of kind of cost growth, which is kind of, if you put that in, it does tend to bring it up to the sort of 4 million mark on its own. But the interesting thing is when people have gone back and studied about what savings did they get, the savings, again, it's kind of in old money, as it were, so it doesn't have all the inflation in there, on average is in excess of that sort of the level that we're trying to save at the moment. So there is a kind of a proof of concept there, as you like, that for this nature of savings, this sort of take out the cost of being in business, you can yield savings of the amount that we're proposing at the moment. So I pause there before I move on to the next bit.
Terry?
Thank you, Chairman. Just coming on to that chart, if I may, Declan. I mean, it's the point I made earlier that, when I was in business, you looked at what the starting point was. What we're actually doing is a comparison of what they believe they're saving. I don't know how that saving matches where their starting point is because the chart doesn't tell me. So without knowing their population or their turnover, that chart to me is meaningless. It's just their belief that's what they can save. And without doing a comparison of where they're starting from to where we are now, compared to where they were starting from, I've got no way of comparing those figures. And I think it comes to the wider issue that consistently for the 30 million savings, I've certainly asked, and I know others have, for some detailed breakdowns of where those 30 million savings are. They're not in this pack. We still haven't got them. So I've got no definition of back office, for instance. I'd like to have a definition of back office both for county and districts. I'd like to have the detailed spreadsheets that show where those savings are going to be. Now, we've consistently asked for that, and that's still not appearing. Now, if we're saying that there is a 30 million saving, we must have some detailed papers behind it to show those calculations, even if it's only the original EY calculations, which I know have been refreshed from what Chris told us the meeting before last. So even if we could have those refreshed spreadsheets, which are not in here, it would give me an indication to see where those savings are, which may inform some further questions, but also give me the ability to analyse those savings to check the veracity of them against the tables.
Right, I think that's a fair point. What level of detail have we got?
Well, I suppose the thing that's sort of confusing and frustrating a bit is we provide the sort of the financial options appraisal, which is included in 111 to 148, sort of back before Christmas, and it does break down the 30 million saving. It does try and put sort of flesh on the bones in terms of the type of areas you target with the savings, and we're trying to target this across the kind of the whole member population, as it were. So just sort of, if we just threw out there a whole lot of working spreadsheets, we'd get stones thrown at us about just kind of trying to sort of drown people in sort of data and not providing anything meaningful. So the point of that sort of that financial options appraisal is to listen to what happened in the different sort of scrutiny reviews and provide that information. But it does provide the breakdown of the 30 million, and we've had very little questions since that information was released. So it's we're a bit loath to kind of just sort of keep providing more and more information if it doesn't actually then get used, because the breakdown's there and it does define back office and the type of.
You just want to refer that? Refer what you're.
So page 111 onwards, I think it is. Yeah, I mean the slides that we'll go through are just extracted from that anyway. That we'll talk through. But
Want to come back, Terry?
Within the pack of information, we will be getting onto this anyway. So I suggest we just plough on, and then if you've got any questions, you can come back on it.
Bill, is your point on this?
Right. But on page 1, 2... Oh, lost it now. If we refer to page 198, which is later on, I know, but it's irrelevant to what we're talking about now. 198.
You read all this morning?
Roman 1. Which savings is that referring to? It's 30 million was provided to committee. It's subsequently clarified to be 16 million.
Yeah, there was some clarity. Yeah, I think. What was that in the context of?
So this was the context of this was the difference in core spending power between Northamptonshire and Leicestershire.
This wasn't the same 30 million.
No,
this wasn't.
So this isn't relevant to this.
Yeah, this wasn't about the 30 million.
The problem with these numbers is that the change, your funding level change and your population changes. So year on year, these kind of numbers kind of drift, and it's kind of the population in Northamptonshire is growing in Leicestershire. So the next time these numbers are done, it's probably going to be the gap will have closed a bit as well. But it's a different 30 million.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're still saying the £30 million saving is a figure that you're working on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Carry on.
Next couple of slides just pick up the phasing of the savings, and it's the reason I put this table in here. It's important to understand the preparation time you've got for an implementation of a unitary to sort of help to understand the pace of that implementation. So obviously Dorset and Buckinghamshire, the most recent two that have been approved, and they've had roughly sort of between 17 and 24 months preparation time for getting that sort of initial nod. So it does temper some of the detail that you want to go to at this sort of stage of a project, because that's 17 to 24 months plus you've got the kind of the time before this happens as well. So you don't want to do over detail, because organisations change through this period and you end up kind of having to redo everything anyway. But it does give you confidence that sort of there's sufficient go live preparation times once you know that you're going to get the go ahead. Hence you can deliver significant savings on day one. And this is all this table does is the phasing assumptions that were kind of used across the different sort of savings categories that make up the £30 million. And you can see from there it's just percentages to try and sort of illustrate it a bit cleaner. That it does deliver a very quick payback, and you do prioritise the kind of the non-service type spend, focusing much more on the admin and the management type stuff. But that said, because the payback's so rapid, there is scope to revise this. It's not a big deal if sort of some of these numbers move around a little bit. It doesn't particularly undermine the case. So the phasing isn't a huge sort of element of justifying the business case. You want to pause there?
Yep. Brenda.
No, Hillary.
Hillary, sorry.
Never mind. Thank you very much. Talking about that, the phasing, I presume this is all part of the implementation costs. So
it's these are the implementation of the savings.
yes, I think the figures of the two examples you gave, which were approximately 18 months to 2 years, this first part of it was quite optimistic. I was at a conference through the county council in the autumn of last year, and this was being discussed by other counties and other unitary authorities, and there were a number of them that have been very successful and were happy with it, but they said it was a minimum of 4 years to achieve the full implementation.
No, it will be the 18 months I was referring to. So you've got 18 months here. Is how long Dorset had to prepare between the Minder 2 decision and actually the new council being put in place, and 24 for Buckinghamshire.
Yes.
Post that date is then when the next slide comes in, and you've basically got 3 years before you've kind of fully completed it.
Yes.
So that does fit much more with what you said there.
Well, yes, I think that needs to be, we get confused with the different words because you're technical, we're not. We have to bring it down. Well, I'm not. We have to bring it down to the lowest common denominator of understanding. And I'm still concerned about the harmonisation, the implementation side, and I still think I have asked this at previous scrutiny meetings I've been on, both panels and at SMC, the Scrutiny Management Commission here, that for do the harmonisation between contracts, services, property, salaries, everything like that, I do still think we need a much better breakdown. I know you've given us some figures here on page 128, which tells us about senior management and district councils in current Leicestershire. But, there's a huge variety, and particularly with getting out of contract, number of employees that are going to be affected. So I think for us to make proper scrutiny, we still need a lot more information of where we are at the moment. I'm not saying where we may be, but what if this happened, everything went through, what would the cost be for redundancy, implementation, and also like property, who's going to be responsible for it? So that to me, we need it. I can't really quite see the quick payback because we already do combine services with other places. So I'd just like to know that.
Nick?
I'll have a quick go at replying as a matter of principle. I mean, if you look at the structure of local government, nobody is reinventing two-tier. Now, I think we can all admit, and when I speak to district leaders, they say that the present system is probably not sustainable in the longer term. Admittedly not, they're opposed to it right now and I'm in favour, but in the longer term I don't think it's sustainable. So nobody's reinventing two-tier. Small unitaries, as Bill has pointed out, fail more quickly because they are too small. That's why I think a single for Leicestershire is the ideal number. Okay, people disagree, but when you look at his facts and figures, a single works. In terms of the savings, I don't think anybody could argue that there would not be savings from having a single unitary authority for Leicestershire. You can question his figures, Terry's questioned his figures, but the principle will be that there will be substantial savings from having a single unitary. And then, of course, you can now question how the savings come about, but that would be for us, because I type of thought that Baroness Scott made the best point. It's transition, then transform. So not to annoy your little villages or you as a borough stroke county councillor, in the first instance, what you would do is you'd just take everything into the middle. And then you would look at it, and then you would decide how many savings you want. Now, if you ran rather than walked to the transformation, the savings would be greater. But there'll be a balance between what you can swallow as an elected member and me to drive out the savings. So transition and transform. So these are accountancy type numbers. We could, and I'm a true believer that these numbers are pretty low, but to be fair, we need to take it all in and transition and transform. So the question about the refuse disposal and collection and all that, there's so many contracts around the county, it could possibly take 5-6 years to get everybody to the same contract. But that doesn't mean the principle is wrong. It just means it'll be slower. You could, for instance, go in and buy yourself out of some of those contracts where other districts have bought it in. But you'd have to look at the numbers to see whether it was beneficial. So in my view, there's no doubt about the single unitary saves money. There's no doubt that the smaller ones are the ones which are in difficulty if you look at Torbay. And the numbers of around 30 million are realistic, bearing in mind we want to transition and transform, not go in there all guns blazing just to save money, Hilary.
Just on the contracts point, because I think that is quite important, because there must be a lot of contracts all around the county. Is it automatic that they transfer to the successor authority, or, you know, if a clause was put in now on any new contracts which said, and in the event of this authority ceasing to exist, so will the contract, would that be legal?
It tends to be when there's been reorganisation in the past, you don't necessarily need a sort of an individual contract provision. It has been that all the sort of the assets and the liabilities and all that have moved from the sort of the existing organisations to the new organisation. So, for example, when we deal with insurance, we're going back to the 50s and the 60s, even though the county council didn't exist. So it'd be the same for all that. They'd automatically kind of novate over.
Anybody else? Or carry on. Right, press on.
Equalisation of council tax is another topic that came up a few times. So the table just tries to compare the council tax bills from the point of view of sort of residents across the different sort of district areas, and you'll see that kind of all the rows are sort of standard apart from the sort of the districts which vary, and obviously that can vary between kind of the funding level they receive from different sources outside of council tax, the service levels offered, service offered by parish councils, or sort of the efficiency of those individual organisations. But what you do face when you sort of adopt a unitary structure is you need to replace the county council and the district council presets with just a single one, and obviously that'll be either one or two depending on the kind of the solution being chosen. So in terms of kind of the outcome of that, the £8 million got a lot of sort of had been talked about quite a bit, and it is a choice. It was just trying to illustrate that actually if you adopted the council tax level of the sort of the lowest district, and it is quite mechanistic, it would be that sort of £8 million pounds, but you do have the discretion if the new council or councils can equalise at a higher rate if they so wish, and different proposals have done different things. The other point to note as well, you get up to 5 years to align, so it's not like a sudden sort of short, sharp shock. You can sort of phase that depending on sort of the level of change you're implementing and the sort of the funding requirements of the councils as well. Parish councils can play a bit of sort of a curveball in here, and obviously kind of if you can transfer services and ultimately sort of the preset to the parish councils, and it kind of can impact the equalisation. But one important point to notice, and you see it in the county at the moment as already through some of the district councils, you can use special expense allowances, so you can still vary the level of council tax in specific areas, even if you don't have a parish council. So it's equalisation of council tax is it's obviously going to be quite a sort of visible area if this sort of proposal went ahead, but it's an area that would need an awful lot of working through. So actually what you did do and what the future structure would be, but it isn't as simple as you just adopt the lowest. There's a few different things can impact it. And they put the referendum limits on at the bottom at the moment, because we're in a bit of a sort of a strange time at the moment. Before the referendum limits, there was always a choice between service level of council tax and the sort of level of savings you wanted to take on. But the referendum limits kind of means everybody kind of herds at the kind of the maximum with the sort of with the handful of exceptions. So it doesn't really fully reflect relative organisation pressures at the moment, that sort of previous slide. So again, that might be something that could change as the government has shown a bit of appetite to slacken those kind of council tax referendum principles. So just moving on from there into the actual sort of savings summary itself. So this is the breakdown of the £30 million for the sort of both the single unitary and the dual unitary. So the next sort of set of slides will take through one by one these different sort of savings items. I'll focus more on the sort of the single rather than dual, because it just to sort of save time basically, because it tends to be a bit of repetition. But one point on this slide I would like to draw out, you see the sort of 4% at the bottom, that's kind of the 4% is a sort of savings level of the total kind of organisational spend. So this kind of, it does kind of give a bit of comfort that kind of that organisational capacity to manage this sort of type of change is kind of the order of magnitude of what we've done before in terms of that sort of that change. And there will be a lot that won't actually change as a result of this. But but I will talk you through these key areas at the moment. So the first one up was the actually, sorry, before I get into that, so again, these sort of key points I just sort of, I suppose, want to stress at this stage to kind of just bear in mind as going through the slides. It is about this cost of being in business. It's not a race to the bottom. It's trying to take out specific activities that don't need to be done anymore. All services that suddenly start to benefit from the county council's existing scale. It's not about sort of, I don't know, sort of a theoretical kind of sort of growth. It's primarily looking at what the size of the county council is at the moment. But it's not just about scale. It is a sort of almost adopting the best of the best, as it were. Looking at different practices across the organisation gives you that further benefit. But at this stage, it is very early stage still in the proposals. We are holding just flip back, a significant contingency. There's that sort of £3 million contingency, sort of roughly 10%, to allow for basically, there's going to be changes to organisations as this sort of process goes on. You can target investment if there is a problem that comes up, or something that members want to kind of correct. You have got scope then with a bit of cash to kind of do something about it, and obviously new information will come on along as well. Sort of revise your sort of approach. Again, another one I sort of stress is these are things that aren't included that were sort of maybe causing a bit of confusion on previous ones. We've based this very much around cost. We're not proposing any changes to service charges to sort of this. So we're not trying to sort of sneak through kind of things like that. Ditto the housing revenue account. Legally, that's ring fenced. So even if you do make any sort of benefits from that, it has to stay to the benefits of sort of current or future tenants. It's not something that they'd contribute to this 30 million. Even if we wanted to, we wouldn't be allowed to. That said, there would be, in theory, a benefit to the HRA if you can bring it together on a similar way that you save some of the administration of those different accounts. But again, that benefit would accrue to the tenants, whether it's sort of the current ones or the future. Trading grants income, again, we haven't tried to sort of push on that. Just sort of assume that the same levels carry on at the moment. Linking related services, again, kind of often you sort of do hear a talk, and it has got sort of merit to it that sort of the district services help with the sort of the preventative nature of some of the sort of the county sort of services, and those linkages have been much closer together. But again, we haven't particularly sort of tried to bring that in. It's just more about that cost comparison. An easier partnership working, CCGs, city council, people like that, they've got less sort of partners to face off with. So again, they're just a couple of sort of context sort of slides. So we'll start just going through the different savings sort of one by one. So the first one up is the members' allowance, and in the scheme of things, it's a relatively small sort of saving. So just working down that table. So if we just compare the sort of the county and the district columns initially, sort of working top to bottom, you see the kind of the expenditure that each member has to look after. So it gives us sort of just a sense of the scale of sort of the breadth of the sort of services is much higher in that sort of that county side compared to the district side. But almost conversely, you'll see there's sort of much fewer members which is driven by the fact there's much fewer members. But that said, the county members do cost more on a per member basis than the districts, which you'd kind of expect because of sort of the scale of what they're looking after. But if you look at on a population basis, despite that fact, it still is cheaper on a sort of almost £1 a council tax basis for residents for that sort of the cost of members. And we're just sort of following that sort of theme through, and we're calculating the unitary savings. Again, it's kind of the cost that each individual member would have to look after is higher than the average in the county at the moment, although it's worth noting less than because the proposal is to double up the numbers of members, less than the current county council. So it does mean that you can run ultimately at £3.40 versus sort of £4.20 on a sort of on a resident basis, and that's the thing that yields the savings. So I haven't put it on there, but it's not huge in the scheme of things, but that members' allowance one is that sort of 500,300,000 sort of level. But it is just driven from that kind of fewer members looking after more services. Moving then into sort of the election size. Again, it's not big in the scheme of things, and just bear in mind this election savings, the number of 4-year figures. So it's only sort of a quarter of this that ultimately accrues on as part of that £30 million. Basically, I suppose I won't work through the individual lines, but the premise is basically you're eliminating the county council elections, which is kind of £800,000 on its own, and then you're crudely making the district elections about 20% cheaper. we've used a unitary comparator on this one to sort of get it down to sort of see what the difference is on a local basis. But it's broadly administrative, so it should using sort of external comparators is a fair thing to do. And you'd always aim to continue that alignment with the parish elections, so you're not kind of making something else more expensive for somebody else as a consequence of this. And again, you can do that through the orders that get laid. Similar, linked to the elections, but obviously sort of slightly different. It's a pure administrative function, the sort of register of electors. So, but we've taken a sort of a similar approach. What's the cost in the sort of Leicestershire area? Compare it to sort of a comparator, a set of unitary authorities, and what does that come out with? And again, it's relatively small in the scheme of things, £500,000 when you're doing that sort of that cost differential that other people's are actually achieving at the moment versus what the actual cost is at the moment for Leicestershire County, not for Leicestershire, for the county of Leicestershire. So the next saving, just going to move into is senior management, and this is just a bit of to try and again give a bit of context. There was an assertion at one of the meetings that sort of compared to sort of the district sort of officers, county council sort of managers sort of paid too much, but it's just kind of, it misses the point about there's quite a mismatch when comparing the different organisations. If you look at sort of the red ones here are just departments of the county council. Whereas these are sort of full districts organisations, they include everything, you know, funding costs, the whole lot. So actually the mismatch is a little bit bigger, but you can see the sort of it's just a crude proxy of levels of responsibilities. You can see the kind of the spans that kind of you have to deal with the sort of the county council. It's just a different order of magnitude to the district council. So if you try to pick up the management arrangements of a district council, it just wouldn't work in the county council context. You wouldn't be able to get the people and the spans of control would just be too wide. Like I say, it's just kind of a proxy, but from that proxy, it does give comfort that the sort of the pay structure is appropriate and reasonable in sort of when you look at this sort of service level comparison versus organisational size comparison. So I just wanted to do that just sort of before we get into this one. So almost, I suppose, it tries to set why it's kind of the sort of the context a little bit, because you'll see there for the district councils versus the county councils, as a proportion of gross expenditure, the expenditure on managers earning over £50,000, it's twice as much in the district context as it does in the sort of the county council context. And I know I keep repeating myself, but it's all about this cost of being in business. You're halving it in the sort of in the county council sort of arrangements rather than sort of having 7 disparate district organisations. And we've used that as a sort of the basis for calculating these savings. The first one is about corporate management. You only need 1 corporate management team instead of 8 at the moment. So you get that immediate sort of drop through. And again, kind of there's plenty of sort of organisations that are bigger than sort of the proposed unitary that can cope with that. So you get a good level of comfort. The adoption of the county council overhead rate yields some more savings, and this is adopting the 2% across that sort of that full expenditure. But it's also important to note that kind of we're not just sort of adding everything together, we're taking 30 million of savings out. So you would expect the level of sort of senior management to contract as well. It's not really acceptable for kind of an organisational shrink in the sort of senior management sort of go unscathed. So again, you reflect that shrinking in the sort of that next line down there. And then the final one is, again, I touched on it before, the new organisation's about 20-25% bigger than the existing county. So you would expect on a sort of that percentage basis, if you were to put the new unitary in there, to that achieve, to have a tougher target than the sort of the existing county council. So we trim a little bit more costs off that for the single unitary, but this is one of the differences for the dual, where that would kind of obviously go the other way. So it's kind of again, senior management tends to be very much of a choice, and you can choose to sort of pick different levels, but there is kind of quite a lot of evidence out there about it is possible to run at a much sort of lower cost.
Declan, can you just define which posts you've got there in senior management, what level?
So this is £50,000 plus. So the reason we picked that is just it's kind of it's a well-defined one through the sort of statement of accounts.
So that would be heads of service, chief officers, that sort of level?
Yeah, probably the level below heads of service, yeah. Next one then, just moving into the back office type saving. This obviously, the document's got a lot more detail on sort of the type of services covered, sort of finance, HR, legal, things like that. And you've got sort of across the county area at the moment, we're spending about £59-60 million, excluding the senior managers that just talked about on the previous slide. And again, it's kind of just reiterate something said before. This is about back office. It's not about the task efficiency. So for example, a district council could be cheaper on a per invoice basis at the moment, but the number of invoices that a new unitary would have to deal with is just a lot less. You're ultimately paying one invoice rather than 8 that you'd be paying previously. So it's kind of, just bear in mind, it's about that kind of, you're doing less as opposed to necessarily sort of that individual task efficiency. It's not trying to knock what people do at the moment, but that kind of that 15% to the sort of the 6% is a similar order of magnitude to what Baroness Scott was talking about. I think they were talking about 19% to 9%, and now they've got down to sort of lower than that. The calculations will be different, but it's kind of you see that repeated across all the sort of the proposals. So again, we sort of calculate the saving in a similar way to the senior management. You adopt the county council rate. It's a lot of these things are a choice. It's kind of shown that you can operate at this sort of level of overhead is by sort of working with sort of bigger services. You don't have to double up the number of finance people. You can kind of have a lot less. You don't have to do sort of multiple statement of accounts. You just do one for the whole organisation. So you get that sort of consolidation. Again, the reorganisation savings. So the organisation is totality is a bit smaller. So you'd expect the back office to kind of reflect that as well. You'd expect it to go a bit better as well. We've gone quite conservative on this, only a 1% improvement. If an organisation is 20-25% bigger, you'd expect more than 1% to come off the back office, but it's just a placeholder for now, really. And then we put in a bit there on the sort of local governments, and this was around kind of area committees, just having money around to sort of deal with sort of new services that sort of pop up. It might not be right. We've got that other contingency, but it was just to put a bit of a placeholder in there again for now. The dual unitary it'd be similar, but obviously you kind of got less scale, so you get sort of. So what we tried to do there was just do sort of like a comparison of sort of fixed versus variable cost, and it came with a sort of a saving level of sort of 10 million rather than the 17 million there. But again, it's kind of in line with what you see in other cases. Moving on then to the sort of service management and admin. There's obviously a lot of sort of subcategories in this, so I won't go through each one just for the sort of sake of time. Just give you sort of a broad idea of sort of how we did it. And the kind of the percentages there is of the percentage of what's been kind of changes. So it's not been distorted with sort of the big services like social care and things like that. But obviously there could be sort of some tangential benefits from that. But you will notice the first thing on that kind of that right-hand column, the saving levels are much lower proportions than the other ones that I've been talking about back office and senior management, apart from council tax, which is the reason that is it's by its nature it's largely an administrative type function. So the first three savings lines, housing, environment and planning, they've all been calculated looking at sort of relative sort of expenditure on each district on a sort of a head of population basis. We kind of stripped out outliers to avoid overstating savings, but trying to look at sort of, well, if someone's sort of spending above average at the moment, move them to the average, and then sort of like just sort of step people below the average on a sort of just almost improving their pecking order one at a time, so that they improve to sort of the next best organisation. And then we've used a sort of comparators to existing unitary organisations of a similar nature to just give it as a sort of a reasonableness check. So the first three, the saving of the scheme, this is kind of on one by one is sort of fairly small, but it's that sort of comparative for what's happening at the moment in the county. Cultural is a lot harder because cultural is much more about kind of choice rather than any sort of statutory responsibility. So we haven't tried to do that for that because it's too easy to kind of trip yourself up. All we've done is said, well, kind of the geographic area of the sort of the county and the district services are the same. The nature of the services, in truth, even across sort of county to district and across the district is similar. So you just target a crude 5% saving on that. And it's sort of, you'd hope that would yield from sort of whether it's sort of joint procurements of sort of the, sharing that sort of that management. At the moment, that is just a sort of an estimated target, so we try and avoid getting to that sort of choice about service levels. Waste, we're able to do a bit more because there's a few established waste partnerships around the country at the moment. So they've published kind of quite a lot of case studies about what they've done. So kind of local knowledge tends to be quite good about kind of what we do at the moment and what could be achieved. So that we just sort of work through with sort of the waste service, what sort of things that could be targeted. I think it's going to be things like labour and vehicle utilisation, joint management, where you can kind of bring these services together. It's worth noting when you look at the case studies, different waste partnership, it tends to be sort of £1.5 to £3 million. So I suppose the changes that we sort of identified on that sort of crude high level basis is sitting at the bottom end of that range. So it's probably an area where in actuality you target much further savings. Mentioned council tax already, largely administrative function. Again, we kind of because of that nature, it's less about a sort of service choice, which we used a comparator group of unitary authorities, and that suggested savings in the range of 1.7 to 3.4 million. So again, deliberately went to the bottom of that end of that range, but you would expect kind of, you know, sort of good savings to be adopted from that, particularly in sort of an area sort of like Leicestershire, where kind of deprivation levels aren't too bad. So you should be at the sort of the cheaper end in truth, but we've gone at the more expensive end for the sake of this exercise. And the other thing that we haven't included is including any sort of performance benefits. You know, the council tax and the business rate collection is a huge amount of money, you know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. So it doesn't take a lot of improvement in collection rates to have a direct financial impact. But at this stage, we haven't included any. But it is the sort of saving that could be brought in at a future point. So that's just sort of a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the sort of 30 million savings. There is more in the pack. The final slide I wanted to touch on, there was a bit of talk about what the right time is to do this sort of initiative. And the thing I just want to sort of illustrate is, if we'd have gone in 2009 when these other sort of the unitaries, your Wiltshires, your Durham, etc., went, that sort of crudely 10 years of savings foregone taken into account, so by the time this sort of, if it went ahead, when this sort of one had launched, and also the sort of that initial phasing. And again, take out the sort of the equalisation, some investment to give it a bit of a sort of a more worst case. So just assuming £20 million of a year, you'd have £200 million of sort of cash, assuming that every other decision was made that was the same sort of sitting there. And you've got a choice what you do with that £200 million. You could, you can invest it, and you get, getting conservative, £10 million an annum that you could spend on ongoing services or offset cuts. You could afford a new leisure centre for every single district and still have £60 million of cash left to spare. You could pay off the third of the borrowing of all the local authorities in Leicestershire, or you could just sort of buy 4% of the land of the entire county of Leicestershire. So you could do a lot with that sort of £200 million, which in truth, like I say, every other decision's been made is the same about services, about where you make the growth and savings choices. But by going at sort of the right time, you've got that. So I suppose it's not just about the financial pressure of the county council, it's about being able to free up resources that are getting spent on overheads to use for other things, and those other things is obviously kind of a political choice. And that's all I have to say.
Right, thank you very much. Right, Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that, Declan. Just one observation on the very first slide, I think it was, of that part of the pack. I don't know if it's up there. But I think for sensitivities across all public sector staff working in councils across Leicestershire, it would be useful, rather than say county council, say new council structure, because we are talking about a new council, not the county council. So I think the right definition in the paperwork of a new council, so that people have no misunderstanding, would be useful. But I just want a couple of points. So I specifically asked Baroness Scott when she was here about the members' allowances, and I looked at the members' allowances in Wiltshire and Durham, and she admitted during that meeting there was no saving between the county and districts before the combination, because you have area committees and all those other things which have special responsibility allowances. So she did admit there was no saving. In fact, I think from memory, and I'd have to go back through YouTube, she actually said she thinks it actually costs slightly more for members than it did before. Now, I'm not disagreeing with that, because that is the cost of democracy, and we shouldn't undervalue the cost of democracy. But what I'm saying is we're showing a saving there, just in that one line, which I don't believe is achievable on the structure which has currently been suggested. So that's just a comment. Now, coming back to back office, what I would really appreciate is, can I have the definition of a back office member of staff, please? We must have a definition we work for, and I need to understand that so I can do that comparison of what we're doing. And when we spoke about the cultural bit as well, what I'd also need, I mean, I appreciate this is about saving money and being more efficient, but what I'm also interested in as a county councillor is, what will be our view on the provision of non-statutory services currently provided by the districts across the county? So what is our view on leisure centres, open spaces, strategic open areas? And how have we mapped into this the cost of maintaining those, or are we just assuming they will go? So where we are at the moment, where the county, I think, has 3 theatres, so are we looking for greater theatre provision, for instance, across the county? Because if we're going to go this route, what we need to ensure is that all our residents have a fair delivery of service in their areas, and it's not just concentrated in certain areas, so that all our residents benefit from what we're looking to achieve. Otherwise, residents will not thank us, because they're the areas which I don't see in here, which we desperately need to look at and we haven't looked at yet, and we haven't discussed, which are just as crucial to residents as to what they might save.
Yeah,
Can I first of all say to Terry, he's absolutely right. We should ditch the word county council. It is a new council for Leicestershire. So if it is mentioned, I think it's not only in the interest of good relationships, but actually factually correct. So if it is in there, can we get rid of that? Again, on the current services, Terry, I still say transition, then transform. I mean, you would take everything as is, and then the new members would decide how they wanted to do things. And as a Conservative member, if I'm honest, I would seek to want to protect some of the things that my residents benefit from. I'm not being rude about adult social care and children's services, very, very important. But the things that I get complaints about, representing a fairly affluent area, are things which aren't statutory responsibilities. And I would seek to want to protect those as best I can. And one of the things, in my view, maybe not your view, Terry, about a new council for Leicestershire, it gives me more money to protect the services that my residents are pestering me about.
But Nick, this is a major concern that every year the pressure on adult social care now mounting children's care, that we have to put growth, considerable amount of growth, and there's no doubt that those services that you've referred to, a lot of us do very important services, suffer as a result of that. We look back at some of the decisions that have been made, right back as far as dismantling the youth service. Now, the danger is that in a unitary authority, what you'd have is a number of services coming in there provided by the districts that some people might see ripe for picking in order to fund these ongoing pressures. And that's the danger. As you rightly say, it is one for new members, but if suddenly all those non-statutory services, the advice from the officers may well be, well, look, these aren't statutory, you don't have to do these, but you do have to put more money into adult social care, otherwise we're going to struggle to meet our responsibilities. And that we do need to address that, and what we can say to people in terms of our ability. I mean, it's very much tied up with the next CSR, I would suggest, and we were speaking about earlier, the fair funding. Byron.
Yes, I think we're getting towards the point where you would have a discussion about how the £30 million of savings that were generated by this move would be applied. And you raise the issue of youth services. Now, this is something which is pretty high up on my agenda at the moment because of a particular issue in my patch where the borough council stepped in to keep a youth service going in one of my major villages, and is now considering withdrawing it. And when I look at the issue, I see that in that particular village there's a very, very low incidence of antisocial behaviour and crime amongst youth because of an outstanding youth club, an outstanding leader that has got a grip of it and has a youth club that has an average attendance of about 70, which is a very significant number. And then when one looks at other villages, and in particular also looks at Melton Mowbray, you see quite the reverse of a problem, where the youth service has virtually disappeared. Now, the youth services provided by this council were an early casualty of the consolidation programme and the savings that we had to make. And we hear a great deal about problems of law and order and the reductions in numbers of police officers. And there's always a gut reaction from some commentators who to say, well, the problem is we haven't got enough police officers that would be resolved. But actually, I take a different view. I think problems with antisocial behaviour and crime start with young people. That doesn't mean to say every young person is a potential criminal, I wouldn't say that for a moment. But if I go back to my time as nearly 10 years when I was involved with the police service as a member of the police authority, and indeed the chairman of it for 5 of those years. I was also the lead member for community safety at that time at this county council, and there's no doubt in my mind that there's abundant evidence to show that when we applied concentration on reducing youth crime and also dealing with problem families, which came along a little bit later, we were gradually getting on top of things, because most crime in this country is committed by people who's in the age range of about 12 or 13 up to 25, and it diminishes after 25 quite steeply. So if you can reduce the incidence of crime and the causes of crime, if I can use the terminology used by a previous Prime Minister, you find actually that you eventually bring about a virtuous circle of improvement, where you not only get a much happier society, you actually get far less crime, far less disorder, and many other benefits. So clearly that would have to, the youth service, I think, and the troubled families service, which will go with it, and some ancillary services would, in my view, be very high on the list of priorities for reinstatement and redevelopment for a new unitary authority, and that's certainly what I would like to see.
So, would this be something for the business case then, to set out aspirations and how a new council might be able to invest?
I think
because what you're not addressing is how do you deal with this continuing demand for social care?
Yeah.
Which that slide, the first slide that was put up, shows what's going to happen by 2040.
We are at the stage now where we have brought the level of services down to something very, very close to the minimum level, which could be judged in any way to be acceptable or tolerable. We've been more successful than most councils in Leicestershire in designing our adult social care offer and our children's care offer, and I think that shows in the results that we get. But we have actually taken a much greater level of savings proportionately in the highways budget, for example. And we are now experiencing very, very considerable problems with our highways, where we can keep up to date with filling the potholes in, which is basically the remedial work and the reaction work, but we're not able to respond to the improvements and development work which new traffic conditions and so on bring about, where a lot of our road system needs improvement and reconfiguration to cope with new traffic levels. And so we're starting to find more and more problems in that area. So we are basically at a cusp of any further savings we have to make in our programmes, and there's £74 million still in our present projections which we might have to make, including the SEN reductions as well, as you know, where I think we start to reach and run into the danger of dipping below the point where the people say, look, this can't go on, this is totally unacceptable. Some might say that it's unacceptable now, and Mr. Bill might take that view. But and in some areas you can certainly draw up examples where it is, and I think the highways issue is perhaps one of those examples. The youth provision is another one. But so we have to look somewhere to be able to improve the position for overall local government services in Leicestershire in the next few years. Now we're anticipating, I say anticipating with some degree of hope, that the fair funding review and the change in business rates devolution will improve our position. And that, but of course, that's relative to other councils, because the Chancellor sees it as a zero-sum game, you know, where some money's taken off some councils and given to others. And there's a strong case for it, which we have put forward in our fair funding review. But there's nevertheless a view that I now take that that in itself will not be enough to restore services and to improve services in the future for Leicestershire to the level which I think future residents of the county will want to see, and which I would want to see as well, and leave as a legacy when eventually I retire from local government, which will happen in a few years' time. Whereas the unitary option offers another quantum change which could improve things significantly in addition to the fair funding service, to mean that in fact things start to get onto an upward trajectory, and hopefully then eventually in a few years' time that the country is in a better position than it is now, and it's got an expanding economy and can allocate more money to local government than it presently does.
Okay, so specifically then, Terry's points were the definition of the back office, the cost of members. I think really the issue about the general spread of you've got the best answer. It would be, in the end, it would be a matter for the new council to determine those priorities, but having regard to our statutory requirements to deal with this increased demand. So what about, do we have a definition of back office, Chris?
If I pick up the member one and Declan will pick up the back office definition, just on the members, the member saving actually is one that we can actually estimate with a certain amount of certainty, because we know how much is spent on members within Leicestershire because they have to publish them in a statement of accounts, and clearly those statement of accounts are audited, so we kind of know that it's 2.9 million was spent last year in terms of members, so we know that. We can calculate based on an assumption around members' allowances how much the new organisation would spend, and hence why we've come up with a figure of saving of 0.5 million. we did have a quick look at Wiltshire. Wiltshire actually spent 2 million on members' allowances and expenses. So if we actually use their figure, we'd make a saving of 900,000. And they've got slightly less members than the 110 we forecast in the new organisation. But I mean, it's a similar scale. So actually, the saving could be more than 500,000, but we factored 500,000 into.
Okay, but what assumptions have you made about special responsibility allowances then?
Yeah, John.
We try to, I suppose, all we're trying to look at this stage is sort of make a reasonable assumption. So for the special responsibility allowance, we looked at what the average of sort of the current district and the current county one was. I think it was either 25 or 50% of sort of the existing district allowance added onto the county one to just add as a proxy. In a similar way to sort of the base allowance was basically the average of the districts plus the current county allowance, to just try and give that sort of reasonable amount. That does tend to give a higher level than areas like Wiltshire have got at the moment.
Okay, and you're going to talk about the back office, yeah.
So the sort of more detailed paper, page 132, does pick up on the back office, and I won't sort of talk through it, but it does identify which are the biggest areas, and that's on sort of page 134, gives a bit of narrative, and it tends to be the property function and information technology tend to dominate it, with sort of finance, human resources, legal being kind of the next set. So it's in terms of back office, we always tend to talk about it. It's not a service that sort of, I don't know, maybe a member of the public had recognised as sort of involved in that sort of direct service delivery to them. So there may be a bit of sort of overlap. Obviously, kind of, I don't know, something like adult social care. There is an information technology system behind the scenes, but it's not necessarily that kind of. It's not receipt of a care service as such that the person gets. So it's more that kind of organisational overhead, infrastructure type things. Those sort of activities that enable the services, as opposed to the actual sort of physical sort of touching the services itself. So there is a bit of blurring truth, but it's not much. It's normally what people would expect.
So if we're going to finance, for instance, Declan, are we including their revenues and benefits?
So revs and bens are, no, basically, I suppose. So this is sort of core finance, the sort of, the sort of type of things that sort of I do day to day. It'd pick up things like internal audit, insurance as well, things like that. But revs and bens would be more on that sort of service side list of things. Similarly, the sort of council tax administration is obviously sort of in there as well.
Well, thanks for that, Declan. But it does come back to my point, Mr. Chairman. If we had some figures, we could actually look at this and see where they are. So if we had some detailed spreadsheets, these are questions I wouldn't need to ask because I could have looked them up.
Is there any more
papers that you've used to prepare this available?
Not particularly tidy. I mean, they won't answer the question you've just had there. There's nothing on those spreadsheet that defines back office. It selects certain things. It tends to do it sort of an overall kind of organisation type basis. But it's kind of there's obviously sort of more detail behind it. But it's kind of you'd end up having to sort of try and talk it through. They're not really sort of designed for sort of just sort of independent kind of consumption, as it were.
I think the answer is there's nothing more available, Terry.
I think the only comment I make, Mr. Chairman, is if there is nothing more available, I worry greatly about the 30 million if we actually have no financial information to support it.
Okay.
Declan did you want to come back?
I think sort of, it's not. There's nothing available. It's just not in a kind of. It's not in a form I could just sort of email you and then you'd sit down and it'd kind of make you happy. It'd probably just wind you up that you didn't understand what you'd been sent. Not a sort of an able to understand. It's just that there's no explanations in there. It's just sort of very rough working papers.
This is another way. We intend to prepare a business case.
Mm-hmm.
Will that contain, in doing that, would you envisage that would have more information on this particular issue?
If you look at the other unitary business cases that have gone forward, they've had far less information than what's already been provided. To an order of magnitude, they've hardly had anything in. So the intention won't be to kind of keep expanding on this. But what we would do is get independent assurance to sort of somebody else to come in and verify that they're reasonable. You just feel that just feels the easier compromise. Because otherwise, you can end up. The danger is just keep going, and then I don't know whether people actually kind of benefit from just sort of providing more and more information.
Byron?
I think members should understand that what's been conducted here is a management accounting exercise, which is very different from a financial accounting exercise where you're working with hard numbers and doing things from the bottom up. What management accountants do is look at overall pictures and do comparisons and estimates and draw conclusions from that, and that's of course is how all business cases are eventually constructed and how in the commercial world business works. Financial accounting is something which is the actual and which is done at the conclusion when something's happened. But for things that not yet happened, you have to work with estimates and uncertainties. And that's the reality of the world, I'm afraid. And whilst in fact there is more calculations and sub-calculations available in arriving at some of the numbers you've been spoken about this morning, it's still part of a management accounting exercise, not a financial accounting exercise.
Okay. All right, Chris, and then I want to bring Hilary.
Just to add to that, I suppose, I mean, Declan's been through the detail and went through a fair amount of the assumptions that we built into the business case and kind of how we've gone about doing it. But we've also triangulated it. So the early part of the presentation, you can kind of see it's not kind of rocket science what we're doing. A number of organisations have done this, and we know what the savings they've made. And we've tested those against what our assumptions are in terms of producing the figures, and they come out broadly the same figure. And we've got contingency within the business case. So I mean, I'm very comfortable that 30 million is going to be there or thereabouts. I mean, things will shift around, no doubt, but it's going to be there or thereabouts. Loads of organisations have done this already. We've talked to them. We've had them here.
Hilary.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for all the information we're getting, the extra information that's not in the papers. Most of this savings is going to be with the reorganisation of a new council to cover a lot of the back office work that's currently done by 8 different organisations. I understand that. My question is, because obviously it's going to mean a lot of different staff and management, when this comes into the operation and New South, will all staff, both at county and district, have the opportunity, if they're in a certain position now...
Hilary, we're going to have a session on that this afternoon.
Okay.
When we're going to have an HR
Okay,
officer
that's
come.
fine.
Is
Thank
that
you
all
very
right?
much. Yes, that's
this has
perfect.
come up, as you know,
Yeah.
One of the witnesses had some quite controversial assumptions and views about that, and so we're going to have Gordon McFarlane coming this afternoon, and you can ask him that very question. Is that
To
fair enough?
to be fair to Hillary, the answer is yes anyway, so we don't wait. Yeah.
So we don't need Gordon then. Okay. I think members might have want to understand some detailed questions about how this process works, and some of us have some memories of it from 20 odd years ago.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that. Right, was that your question? Yeah, okay. So now I've got Brenda, and then I've got Peter.
Thank you, Chair. My main concern, apart from the now obvious financial benefits of pursuing a unitary council, would be the loss of identity and local views. I liked the idea of the area committees, and I think that's the view that we're going down at the moment. Has this been fully costed? Is it in the papers where I haven't seen it? And would that be included at the transition stage rather than the transformation stage?
So the area committees, it's assumed that, I suppose, that members won't get paid an additional for that. It'd be part of that sort of increase in sort of the basic allowance. So we've included a small amount for functions like democratic services, can do that sort of coordination and sort of the arrangement of them. So from that aspect, on the current sort of high-level proposal that's in there at the moment, the answer is yes to it being costed. Obviously, if those sort of proposals change and develop, we'd have to sort of, that scenario we'd have to revisit. But I think the next session is Tom's going to sort of talk in depth about that.
From my point of view, Simon, the identity and local views are absolutely paramount, and the area committees, whether you go, because it's a choice you're going to have to make later on as a scrutiny, whether or not you like area committees or you want to beef up parishes, they're absolutely key to a new council for Leicestershire.
They would be key for me.
Yeah.
Yes, if I can just add to that, one of the great benefits of going through this scrutiny process and having the challenge that we've had on the initial proposals is that it's emerged that the question of area committees, and indeed the planning side of it as well, which has not been mentioned but is allied to that, does require significant improvement. And we did hear about the alternative ways of doing that from Simon Hennig and from Jane Scott, if you recall. And they were very different and different approaches in the way they set it up. And clearly one of the major tasks of moving towards the business case is to take that information and to take those views and to develop the whole case and understanding of how area committees and the area planning committees would work to a level which can be more convincing than we've been able to do so far.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we're all agreed on that. Right, Peter Bedford.
Hi. Just 2 points, Mr. Chairman. Coming to Terry's point about the information behind, say, the back office, for example, I get that you have to produce a business case and it has to be to a high level. You can't go into the granularity in this report simply because you're making so many assumptions. But I think it probably would help if, for example, on page 113, you've got the summary of all the different aspects of the cost savings that are anticipated. If, for example, the 17.4 million back office, if there was some kind of waterfall where we could see at a high level how that's broken down. I get Terry's point around some of the assumptions that we've made, but if that was a little bit clearer for members, I think that would probably help members to be a bit more satisfied with confidence behind the figures that are used. But I get your point that it's difficult to go down to the granularity. And the second point I wanted to make was around the independent assurance that we're going to get on the numbers. I mean, I'm confident that this will deliver savings, but I think members would be more satisfied that and have confidence that we're having some kind of independent assurance that those figures are going to be verified. So what have we got in place to ensure that that's going to happen?
I'll give Declan a bit of a rest for a moment. Just in terms of the independent view, we will get somebody in, and it will be somebody who's kind of well known to actually have a look over the business case when it's finally done, verify it, get into the detail of it. and in effect validate the work that we've done. So hopefully that will give assurance to members that you know the figures we've done are accurate. In terms of the presentation, there is a lot of detail actually within the papers. I mean, we all have a look about how we've presented it, and maybe there is some graphics we can use to kind of make it, I don't know, bring it a bit more to life. So we'll look at that for when we do the final business case.
Can I thank Peter Bed for the uses of the words granularity and waterfall?
So just to be clear, we're talking about an audit. Someone like we had Ernst & Young or Deloitte. No, not Deloitte. We don't have them, will we? Someone that we would trust to bring in and do that. Just so that everyone understands what you're talking about when you say bring someone in.
I didn't want to mention a name, to be honest, but it will be of somebody, you know, it'll be one of the big four or whatever, or, you know, a well-known branded kind of consultancy.
Right.
Oh, hang
Okay.
on, everyone. Brenda wants to come.
Sorry, Chair, could I just make a plea? If you are going to use graphics, and that could you make them so that we can actually see them on there, please? And don't make them too fancy, because you know what you're talking about. We don't. So we need walking through. Thank you.
Right, okay, I think we've done... Bill, quickly then.
Yes, we go back to the first slides where you showed the population growth and age growth. Have you worked out the cost of that over the future years compared with the £30 million you're hoping to save by going unitary? Yeah. Will it actually achieve anything at the end of the day, or are we going to a black hole that you're not going to fill anyway?
We definitely costed it out over the next 4 years. The point of that slide is to show that the demographics of Leicestershire and indeed the whole country is a major impact on public finances. And my own personal view is you can't insulate it by just keeping the current status quo of, I don't know, 7 districts and a county council. That is going to impact on the whole of the public sector, because the government is going to be divvying up the cake in a certain way. And when the cake is not big enough to cope with all the demands, districts are going to get hit like the county's going to get hit. And I suppose what the unitary does is it looks at how the best way you can spend that public money in totality across all services. And I don't think just by keeping everything separate, it insulates the people of Leicestershire in terms of that, what the impact of that is on public services.
That wasn't the point, Chair. The point I'm trying to make is, if you make these £30 million savings, how many years is that going to buy before you run out of money anyway? Because that population growth you showed us on the board was quite substantial. If you say the cost now is adult social care and children's services running at a very high level, you should be able to work that out, how long it's going to last on the new structure. But that's not been told us. We don't know.
Doesn't that depend on
4 years, 5 years, 10 years?
legislative changes come in? So, for example, we've been waiting for this white paper on social care. Is it? There could be a change at national level that does have an impact. We don't know.
There's one thing. There's one thing for absolute certain: that 30 million minimum saving will help. You can't say that it won't help. So without it, things will be even worse. Is what you can definitely agree on. Even you must be able to agree with that.
I don't disagree, Chair. But the thing is, how long would it last anyway? What time are we talking about?
Well, I want to bring this session to a close because we've got an important members wanted to discuss area committees, and you're not going to have any time to do that. Right? Who's going to? One person to sum up. Byron.
Just on, back to my view of the future. What I think local government needs, and specifically Leicestershire as a whole needs at the moment, is a significant injection of funds into local government, or saving of funds, to bring us above the threshold, which I think is very, very close to the minimum threshold where we are now. And possibly some reordering of that expenditure to rebalance it slightly. But in the longer run, Mr. Bolt is right about the demographic pressures, because they're going to continue to add to the costs, particularly in social care. But I think also there are other pressures as well, like the increasing population of the country, which are going to add issues about the provision of education and school places, and also highways and so on, as well as the technological changes which are going to happen too. So in the longer run, there has to be a buoyancy to the amount of money which is available for the local government in comparison with the national government as a whole to gradually improve services. In other words, the consolidation that we've seen through the austerity programme of the last 8 or 9 years has to be brought to a halt, and it has to be reversed, so we start to have an increasing level of resources which matches the changing environment and changing demands. And only that, in the end, will bring it about. But
I don't think there's anyone here
we do
that...
need a one-off, though, to do some immediate corrections in the next few years.
I don't think any of us would disagree with that, Byron, from whatever side we come. Okay, so let's draw this session to a close. Thank Chris and Declan for the finance, because I think that was an important one that we've covered. Now we want to move on to look at, before lunch, the issue of area committees and planning. I think Tom Pennell is going to join us. This starts at page 149. And what we asked for here, arising from the previous meeting and discussions, was some more detail and an options appraisal. So, Tom, would you like to take us through this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The Commission has previously considered the suggested model unitary structure, which includes local area committees and area development management subboards, the latter covering planning issues, and those were described in the report considered by Cabinet on October the 16th and can be found on pages 33 to 36 of the papers in front of you. I should perhaps emphasise it will of course be for any new council to decide its structure. So that model structure was put forward as a suggestion to show how a new council might devolve some decisions and responsibilities to local areas. Members will recall that the suggested model structure suggested that there might be 5 area development management subboards, and that's what it says in the paperwork. But in the context of evidence provided by Baroness Scott and further consideration of the matter, it is now the view that there should be 7 such boards based on existing district council boundaries, acknowledging the fact that district-based local plans will continue to provide the policy framework for local planning decisions for a number of years while a single local plan is being prepared. So just to note that there has been that movement since you last saw the paperwork. The paper, which starts at page 149 of your pack, sets out an appraisal of the approaches to area committees and local planning issues adopted by Wiltshire and Durham councils, and this has been prepared at the request of the Scrutiny Commissioners to help inform your consideration of this matter. Both of the councils, Durham and Wiltshire, have indicated that any model for area committees and boards should be co-designed with the local community as well as be subject to public consultation. So it's likely and perhaps desirable that different counties will find that different models are suitable for their local circumstances. So of course neither of these models may be ideal for Leicestershire, but we think it's a useful consideration for you to take account. And I think that is reflected in the different approaches taken by Wiltshire and Durham, although you'll obviously notice that there are many strong similarities between them. There's a lot of information in the paperwork here, and you'll probably be relieved that I don't plan to go through it line by line. What I will do is focus on some of the key features and differences between the approaches taken by the two councils. And it's probably worth stating that I don't really have any more information on the approaches that they've taken other than that's in the paperwork here. What we've tried to do is include everything that we've been provided with by the two councils so that you've got that in front of you. So if you ask for more detail from me, I may struggle to be able to provide that. So what you might particularly want to concentrate on is which of the two proposals you prefer, whether there are aspects that you think are particularly suitable for Leicestershire or which are particularly unsuitable for the county, and perhaps indeed whether they've missed issues or areas which could be part of local area responsibilities in a new council in Leicestershire, but which they haven't considered in their area. I'll start with Wiltshire and Durham's equivalents of the local area committees suggested for the new Leicestershire Council. In Wiltshire, these are known as area boards, and in Durham, area action partnerships, and they're described on pages 150 to 160, and a brief commentary on the two approaches is provided on page 160. You will note a number of similarities between them. I think the key difference is that Wiltshire's area boards are formally constituted, whereas Durham's area action partnerships aren't, and that means that in Wiltshire, executive powers can be delegated to the area boards, and that on those boards only the unitary councillors can vote on the committee. Although you'll note in the paperwork that there are other non-voting members on those boards, but they aren't able to vote on those executive powers. In Durham, partners and stakeholders are full members of the area action partnerships. They can vote, but only on the use of an area budget to support local priorities, and the final authorisation of those decisions needs to be made by a senior officer making use of delegated powers. That's a model that is perhaps better in securing partner buy-in to decision making, but it does limit the scope for the devolution of decision making. So there's a judgment there about which is most desirable. Perhaps also worth noting that Durham's area action partnerships are made up of area forums, which I understand anybody can turn up to, and area boards, which have 21 members, made up, I think, broadly in three groups of members of the public, members of the council, and members of parish councils. I think that's the situation. Rosemary's nodding.
So there's 7 councillor members. 6 of those are Durham do call themselves county council. So 6 of those are unitary councillors and 1 is a co-opted parish councillor. Then there's 7 members of the public and there's 7 partners who are nominated.
Thanks, Rosemary, for that clarification. And that detail is on pages 152 to 153. Yeah. Commission, I won't talk about the detail of these, but commission members may be particularly interested in the following aspects of the two options. So their functions, which are set out on pages 150 to 151. The budgets that they have allocated to them, including local councillor budgets on page 154, and the delegated powers in Wiltshire on page 155. Obviously, no delegated powers in Durham. If I can move on to the planning side of things, the planning governance arrangements are covered on pages 161 to 178, and I think it's fair to say that that is in quite a bit of detail. It sets out which decisions sit with a county planning committee, with area planning committees, and those issues that are delegated to officers. So you've got the full picture, and it also covers that the cabinets in those areas have responsibilities for things like the local plan itself. Both areas have a county planning committee or strategic planning committee, as it's called in one of them, and these are described on pages 161 and 162. And these principally make decisions on major planning applications. Both of them, for example, define a major planning application in relation to housing as developments of 200 homes or more, but there are other major planning applications defined in their schemes as well. Minerals and waste applications, and the implications of major developments in other areas on the county. So, for example, in an adjoining area. So those big strategic applications that are of perhaps county-wide significance. As I mentioned, responsibility for local plans sits with the cabinets of the two authorities rather than with the county, county planning committee or indeed the area planning committees. So on transition, the existing district-based local plans become the responsibility of that cabinet, and that obviously sets the context for more local decision making. The area planning committees are described in the remaining pages up to page 177. Again, I won't. There is a lot of detail in there, and I'll assume that's been read, and can obviously take questions on that. But I think the commentary on page 177 to 178 notes that there's considerable consistency in the approaches across the two councils. In both cases, the area planning committees are based on the former district council boundaries, recognising that the district-based local plans continue to remain in force for some time after the new council has been established. I think in Durham, they're still in force as they're preparing their single local plan. And we understand that approach of area planning committees being based on former district boundaries is the approach taken in other new unitary counties as well. There are some minor differences. In Wiltshire, all of the local planning committees, area planning committees, meet in their local area. In Durham, a couple of them meet at County Hall. So it's that'd be a judgment to make about where the best place for meetings are. There's also some differences in the composition of the committees, which are set out in paras 15 and 16 on page 177 to 8. And it's noted that each of these have their advantages. That's around the balance between area representation and county-wide political representation, and the two councils have taken slightly different approaches to that, obviously recognising that there's a need for county-wide consistency in planning decisions, but also a need to take account of the local area knowledge of local councillors. On that point, I was planning to leave it and invite questions and comments.
Right, should we take the area committees first and separate this? Because there would be very much a difference between the two. The planning ones would be, as I see it, very much development control and regulatory, their functions. And it would be important, I think, for the reasons that Baroness Scott identified, that if you tried to deal with planning issues in the community meetings, that's probably all you'd do. You'd never talk about anything else. And I think anyone who's double-hatted now will agree with that. So in terms of the community forums or community area committees, who would like to make some comments or clarify? Rosemary? Rosie.
Yeah. Can I just have a point of clarification, please? Thank you for this, very comprehensive. I appreciate I'm buying into a strategic effort here, and I'm quite happy to do that now, and it is the strategic point of having area committees, because I think that's important. However, to go back, can you just clarify, they are subject, if one were to be minded to go ahead with a new authority, to public consultation. Therefore, rather than saying we're going to have a Wiltshire or a Durham model, Leicestershire could end up with a hybrid model that suits us. Could you just clarify and talk on that before we go on, Terry?
I mean, that's absolutely right, Mrs. Page. The Durham and Wiltshire models are ones that they've developed, and they say they did that in consultation with their community before they finally adopted them. And of course, a new council for Leicestershire would similarly be able to look at what other councils have done, including Durham and Wiltshire. It would be able to look at the suggested model structure that's been prepared by the county council and which you have in the papers, but also to talk with local communities and consult on that with the wider public before making a final decision. So it's very much something that the new council will need to make a decision on, but taking account of all of that information.
To just come back, then I don't have to. The same principle applies then also for the planning and the planning power set out within that, because if you're looking at the planning, I mean, I could make loads of comments which are just not relevant at this point. So again, via public consultation and, to get a model. And then, of course, there is also all the local plans which have to be adhered with. So we're talking individual local plans, however, ideas moved over, subject to public consultation, yes?
That's right. Again, the new council would make its proposals for for the planning arrangements. I would very much assume that the new council would want to consult on those with local communities and get wider views. And I think what the leaders talked before about transition and transformation, that's I think it's unavoidable in the case of local plans. Actually, you would need to transition over the existing local plans. They would continue to provide the planning policy framework for local planning decisions, and then over a period of time you would transition to you would transform to having a single county local plan.
Briefly, sure, local plans have to remain. They're definitely, as Tom says, part of the transition. I'm also a believer that local planning should stay local. So if you can, as a committee, form a view about what you want to do with the local planning committees under some sort of de minimis level, that would be useful. And also it would be useful if the Scrutiny Commission could come up with a preference to go into business days to consult on. Then if when we go out to consult, people want something different, at least we've shown them an offer. To go out there and say, hey, what do you want, would be difficult. And I'd like, well, it's your call, Sam, and your committee to form a view about what the Scrutiny Commission would like to see in terms of the two options, which is the Durham or the Wiltshire, or a hybrid of the two. The Wiltshire one gives you the power to delegate more downwards, but then again it takes away some of the local people that can go on and input into it. So you'll just have to form a view, but it would be useful if you could form a view.
Okay, that's helpful. Right, Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Do you want me to do both parts as everybody else is, or do you want me to stick to, area boards and then do the final? And I can come back with the planning one afterwards, right? Thank you. I know that people were going at so. Coming back to page 152. I know that prior to the presentations from Wiltshire and Durham particularly, we were looking at 7 boards. Do we think that's sufficient? Now, bearing in mind, the largest one here has got a population of 36,486, and we're suggesting a population of somewhere around 96,000 per area board. It would seem that 7, in the context of experience from others that have gone this route, is considerably out of sync. Having said that, there is a cost of it. I mean, I know that Durham fund now is to 120,000 a year, which would be 1.76 million of our savings disappearing overnight. And also Declan did say that he had done his figures on members' allowances based on no increased allowances for area boards and area committees. But if you look at both Durham and Wiltshire's allowances, all chairmen of the area boards and committees get increased responsibility allowances. So if we're looking at a consistent policy, as I said originally on the members' allowances, it seems flawed, which I still maintain it is. But on the second one, do we now believe that a population of somewhere between 20 and 36,000 might be more desirable than a population of 96,000 from an area board, particularly where we're trying to make sure that the public do not perceive there be a democratic deficit should we go this route?
So I don't think we've actually formed a fixed view on this, on how many area boards. I have a recollection of a number around 10. Yeah, but if the view of you guys here was you thought that they required more, obviously we can take that into consideration. And also the view, if you think an area chairman would require a special responsibility allowance, that is a view you should put forward. My view is if they've got extra work, they're entitled to extra money. Because the thing we all struggle with at the moment, and we're all doing borough councils, is finding people to do it, because the remuneration for people is particularly poor, especially if you work for someone. You know, your boss doesn't want you to have time off. If you take the time off, he docks your money. You know, I think we've got to think about these sort of things moving forward, but they're for you to suggest, and that's why you're here, and these are useful points he's making.
All right, Joe, it's a matter for us in our report.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, as I said to Baroness Scott and Nick at the time, there is a cost to democracy, and I think sometimes we try and do it on the cheap. And I particularly asked Baroness Scott about whether a lot of our members are effectively full-time, which they now are, because she said she made exactly the same points Nick has made about getting them to have the time to do it effectively. So I do accept that, and I suppose my preference for what it's worth is that, you know, I believe that 96 is a huge figure and would have to come down considerably more area boards. I mean, for a population like ours, you'd probably be looking at about 20, I would guess.
Goodness. Right. Okay. Terry Einen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think the area boards, I think we need to work with the population to decide which areas they would cover, because I can see the point of going for just the district council levels, but I'm certainly aware, at least in North West Leicestershire, that there are communities, for example, Castle Donington area, who already feel that they are not being fully represented. So I think I can see the point of having perhaps smaller boards. I think it's going to be really important to set out an options appraisal with the population as to what do you want it to do and how do you want it to be constituted. I think in conversation with Simon Hennig after the meeting, when he came, he was saying, well, yeah, perhaps we would have been better off being able to delegate more powers and to be formally constituted, though there are huge advantages to the model that he's got. I think the model that Wiltshire's come up with does give us much more opportunities to retain power at that lower level, which I think is something that people are very, very worried about. And I think that in the Wiltshire model, you've got the opportunity to have people on the board but not voting members, and to ask for a show of hands, so that there is the opportunity for there to be a test of public opinion. And for people to be involved in that. So I think it's how we can structure that. I'd be interested to know legally how we can ensure that the boards can allow for that kind of engagement and have proper delegated powers. And I think it's also going to be interesting to think, well, I think before we decide exactly how to build it, we need to think what are they going to do, because I think some of the stuff that you can get to do under the I think both of the models to an extent are small highways, for example, that in a sense we could be giving people back the highways forums that some of us knew and loved, but in a way that actually makes them more functional, because we would be taking genuinely local decisions about minor traffic schemes genuinely locally. So I could see the point of that. And I'm also aware that there are, certainly in North West Leicestershire, apparently we have a local health and wellbeing board. I've asked about it. We still don't seem to get to know anything about it or go to it as opposition councillors. I'm not even sure that the non-opposition councillors know that much about it. And you think, well, this is an opportunity to put those groups into one functioning area board that we can then all get behind. And I've got comments about the planning issue, which I'll come to later.
Any point to that? I think Rosie's point about how you set these things up from a constitutional point of view. I don't know, one of the concerns, I've got my microphone on, one of the concerns that Cornwall chap expressed was that they kept changing every time the administration changed. And that doesn't go down well with the public. I suppose the best you can do is set them up in the constitution and hope that a subsequent administration doesn't change the constitution. But I think that they would need to be on the most permanent formal footing that they could be, to give confidence that they wouldn't be abolished or made into. The problem with the highways forums was they were a talking shop. They couldn't actually do anything. They could advise, they could receive reports, and that was all very helpful and useful. But actually, they couldn't say, this is where the proposal is for this scheme or this money to be spent. Actually, we think there's a higher priority down the road or in the next. And the consequence of that is something gets done, something doesn't get done. But that would be the point of having them. So is that the best we could do? Is it put them in the constitution, Tom?
I think that probably is the case, actually. I mean, it is perhaps the one issue that we haven't got information from Wiltshire and Durham on, is how they've captured it in their own constitutional arrangements. I think, although Rosemary is jumping in now.
Sorry, the majority of the information on Wiltshire actually comes straight out of their constitution. So the majority of the stuff in the table I've just lifted straight from their constitution, so it's definitely all there. On the other hand, Durham merely mention that they have an area structure in their constitution. So the information's slightly more difficult to find. It was on the website in various different ways, and they have sort of like advice sheets and annual reports that are quite useful. But if you want it formally constituted, then the wording would probably end up being fairly similar to what Wiltshire have done.
If I could perhaps just mention one or two other things in response to Mrs. Einen's comments. Paragraph 79 on page 33, which was the Cabinet report back in October, talks about the sorts of issues that you would want to take into account in the designing the geography of a local area committee. So it talks about basing it on electoral divisions, local delivery arrangements such as integrated locality teams and parliamentary constituencies. Also talks about them having roughly similar sized populations, but then goes on to say it's crucial that the areas should reflect natural communities in terms of the economic and local interests and identity. So that would need to be a consideration, I think, in terms of deciding the geography. And then just in terms of the voting arrangements, if I can just refer to the voting arrangements in Wiltshire on page 156, which reflect what Dr. Einen was saying. So only the elected unitary councillors can vote, but they do also emphasise that area boards will seek to reach decisions by consensus where possible involving all participants. So that would include the non-voting members of those boards as well. So again, that's something that you can build into the culture of those organisations and I guess into their terms of reference.
So what you're saying is that you can have other people there, just the same as we do, say, at children's services, where there are other nominated people. But when it comes to voting, they're just not able to vote. But they can speak, they can make their points. And one of the things that surprised me on both those agendas, there was no opportunity for public questions or engagement during the course of the meeting. I think that would be crucial, to have a session where people could just turn up, because that might mean that some of those issues could be dealt with there rather than have to be dealt with back at the HQ. Right, David Bill.
Thank you, Chairman. Nick said earlier on that local planning should remain local. Now, I've got a fundamental problem with this.
David, we're coming to planning shortly. This is area committees, which wouldn't have planning in them.
We're going to discuss planning later, are we?
Yeah. All right. It's all right.
Right.
Okay.
Nothing to comment on this.
Anything else on area committees?
Peter.
Yeah.
Just a brief one. Back to finances, I'm afraid. The implications of the number of area committees on the cost savings in terms of how that's being built into the business case. Could you elaborate on that? Because there's different views in this room as to how many area committees we should have, the composition of them. There's going to be a financial impact to that.
I think Declan sort of tried to answer that a little bit earlier in the sense that he said that there had been allowances made for the the additional cost for the democratic services function and things like that, but I don't think any detailed costing has been done of any additional allowances for members of those committees. So I think it is fair to say that the more of those committees that you have, or the more expensive they will be to administer. But I think in the overall scheme of the cost of the new council, that will be a relatively small amount. But I'd have to go back to Declan just to double check what further work had been done on that to date.
Yep. All right. Okay. Right. Planning. So you've outlined, Tom, how they operate in that, and that you have a overarching strategic committee that deals with big applications, big issues, infrastructure, presumably new roads, things like that. That would all get dealt with in a county-wide, and then there would be, what we're saying at the moment, 7 local planning development control committees that would deal with the more local nitty-gritty stuff. Is that a summary?
That's right.
Yeah.
And
but
as currently
right.
some issues
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But the policy in terms of the local plan, that would rest with the cabinet. But surely you'd want to, during the preparation of that plan, you'd want to involve the members who are actually making the decisions. So presumably you, I don't know how it's done. how it's done at Harbour is we have an advisory committee that reviews the local plan. You can't have the cabinet undertaking a whole review of what would be a county-wide plan. You'd have to have somebody that involved more members that they could have an input into what the policies were in the plan.
North West the same as you, son. They have a local plan committee. I mean, ultimately it rests, I think, with the cabinet because it's a cabinet system. But there is a local plan committee, and I'm sure if you'd got 7 planning committees, and there might be an argument to be 8 because Charnwood is just so big. You would consult those 8, and then ultimately it would have to be decided by a cabinet because of the way it's constituted. But obviously you wouldn't want 8 people just to sit down and do it because you'd want to consult the whole of the county area.
Yeah, yeah, because it would need to have detailed policies in for different parts of the county. Anything to add, Tom?
I mean, Wiltshire make it very clear. I was trying to find the relevant clause, but I'll do it from memory. Wiltshire were very clear, as indeed were Durham, about the fact that local plans would be finally approved by cabinet. Wiltshire were clear about involving the local planning boards or local planning committees in a consultative way and getting their input into the local planning process. From memory, the Durham ones talked about their planning boards not having any input to the planning process. So that seems to be an issue where there was a different approach taken by those 2 councils. But I think from my own sort of professional view, it would seem helpful for a local committee to be feeding in. Whether that's the local planning committee, which has a particular role around dealing with planning applications and those sorts of things, or whether it would be the area committee, which perhaps would be better suited for inputting into policy, would be something to explore, I think.
David, Bill. Now we're on planning.
Yes, I have concerns that a lot of this discussion here is irrelevant simply because we talk about planning, we talk about local planning, we talk about community involvement and all the rest of it. But when it comes to the decision-making process, we are ultimately ruled not by what we think as planners, planning committee members, or what the community thinks, but what the planning inspectorate decides, without any local involvement whatsoever, and an increasingly less public involvement. Decisions are now taken in Bristol and invariably taken against the wishes of the people we represent. This last year, I have seen a series of outrageous decisions taken by the Planning Inspectorate, which the people I represent cannot understand what's happened. And of course, the media, the social media, is full of complaints about the council, councillors, even though we have done our best to represent the views of the people who have come to us. I can't see how just simply changing the planning governance arrangements, moving it from a borough level, district level to a county level and back again to a planning, is going to be of any relevance at all unless we can address the situation that we are faced with, and that is that the government itself is deciding what should happen in our communities, deciding for us, making massive decisions, changing the face of Leicestershire forever. And I think I've got friends across here who will know what I'm talking about. I want to go into that again. But the face of Leicestershire is going to be changed forever, and there is not one person in the local community's views is going to be taken any notice of. Therefore, I have the gravest doubts that any of this is relevant until we sort out proper governance of planning.
I think there's a lot of public members of the public would agree with you. Planning has been centralised probably more than any, well, with the exception of schools, any service in the last 10 years. But I'm not sure we can address that here. What they say is if you have an up-to-date local plan that meets your housing numbers in full, then you have control. If you don't, then it's decided by the MPPF or by the inspector.
Yes, even when plans come forward of a massive scale which are not even referred to in the local plan, the government itself will decide now to push ahead with these plans, regardless of any structure plan, local plan, strategic plan, any plan you care to mention. The government itself decides, and the government is now deciding that economic pressure overrules every other consideration. I'm afraid that's the fact of the matter.
He may well be right, but we can't address that here. All I can say is, I think, in my view, a county structure plan done across the whole county would carry greater weight than 7 or individual district plans. Now, district leaders may argue with me, but that's my belief. But the principle of what David's talking about is, well, if you don't like what the government's doing, when there's a general election, vote against them. And you advocate that, but at the moment you've been singly unsuccessful.
No, it's an argument between local government and central government, and I don't think it matters which colour central government is. It has this view that it will decide today.
Okay. Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not as cynical as David. I actually think that the local plan process is one of those things that actually does work pretty well in most areas, because it's out to public consultation twice, as is the delivery DPD document. It gives the public 2 chances to attend public inquiries into the plan and have those discussions. Where I think we do need to consider it is that where it would need to be considered is how it would fit in with the constitution of a new council. And the reason I say that is if we look at something like the Strategic Growth Plan, which I think was an excellent bit of work done by 8 councils, it went to full council in 7 of those councils, but went through cabinet in 1. And I actually think that what we would need to do is design a system whereby you have major things like the local plan, like the SGP or anything subsequently. It should be a full council discussion and decision, and therefore we might need to look at how the cabinet system reflected on that. That's not because of any lack of faith in cabinet, that's because of democracy seen to being done in a larger structure, and therefore to keep that democratic deficit. And on that same basis, if one looks at page 161, there is a suggestion here that the limit for anything going to a planning committee should be 200 houses or 4 hectares. Or is it not?
That's for the county-wide. So if it's a more than 200, it will go to the county-wide committee.
Under 200 again.
If it's under, then you. Well, I think there is an issue there, because what it seems to be in the
I couldn't
case
see
of
what
Wiltshire,
the limit was. I couldn't see what the limit was for if it was under.
No, you're raising an important matter where that trigger is, because I think there is a debate to be had of what represents
Because I mean,
major
the
development.
the district council looks after my division area. At the moment, it's 10 houses or more that go to a planning committee. Now,
that's the definition
residents
of major.
find that as very palatable because they get to have their say, they get to come along. And I think democracy needs to be seen to be done, even if residents don't like the decision at the end of the day. So I think that where you can construct proper local plans, where they've been seen to go through the process, I think residents will buy into them. Clearly, as David Bill says, there will be times when the inspectorate make decisions we don't like, but frequently, sadly, that's because, and where I do agree with David here, is we can only actually raise objections on planning issues. If those planning issues aren't valid, we can't say we don't like it and we don't want it. And I do agree with David, there is a case where strategic sites perhaps should have more local involvement, but you're damned if you do, damned if you don't of the government. You never build a strategic site anywhere if you ask the local residents, because they'd all say no. But that doesn't mean that the local residents shouldn't have a platform to actually raise their concerns and objections. So I think we would need to structure this well and properly. And I do find it strange from David Bill that from a party where in their last manifesto they said we are going to build a minimum of 10 garden towns and cities with no local involvement or decision making. I find it strange that he supports a party that wants no local decision making.
You're starting to get. I don't think he did say that anyway, but I think you're getting a bit controversial there. It doesn't. Okay, so I think the key point you're making is that consideration needs to be given in a Leicestershire model about what should go to the strategic committee, what is dealt with by the local area committees, and what the triggers are in terms of ensuring that it's a member decision and not delegated to officers. And there'll be 7 different varieties of that already, and we'll need to look at that. I think there's a piece of work to be done about how that call-in and decision-making process would work. I don't think we want to go into that now, because you really want to do that if you know it's going to happen. It's a piece of work that needs to be done. Are we okay with leaving that do we flag it up as an issue that needs further work? Okay. Terry Einan.
Yes, I think it's part of the same discussion. I think looking at the different models, 200 or more dwellings, going up to the county or unitary level. I think in my patch, where we've got something like 4,500 houses in one parish, the idea that we would, as a result of this, take the decision making even further away from local communities, and even more centralising those kinds of unpopular decisions. I think we've really got to think of this again. I'm not satisfied with either of the models that Wiltshire or Durham have put forward. I'm interested in the numbers that they have on their planning committee. So I think we've got a lot of questions we could be putting in our consultation documents, and the way that they structure them are very different, with Wiltshire seeming to be much more smaller committees and much more highly localised, or attempting to be highly localised, whereas Durham have a lot of local members, but also a balance from the wider council. So you think there is all sorts of opportunities here, but I think the one opportunity we mustn't lose is the opportunity to have more consultation locally, because I am totally with Mr. Bill on his concerns about the current planning. We don't have a planning process. We have a reacting to developers' whims process, which is what we're having to put up with. How can we strengthen communities and also strengthen strategic planning as a result of this, so that it's more functions even better?
Okay, I think we all would agree with what you're saying in principle. Kevin Feltham.
Thanks, Chairman. A few things. Number one, I think we should not forget the fact that this is, as and when this occurs, and I take the leader's point, I think this is going to happen, it's inevitable. When is the bigger question. But is not to forget technology. The Secretary of State for Health has already announced in his 10-year plan the use of Skype, probably, for GP appointments. I have no idea how it works. How do you show someone your knee? Did it work properly? I don't know. However, that's the way it's working, clearly. We're already experimenting with the use of Skype here at County Hall with the ESPO Management Committee, with all our partners across the East Midlands. I think that's just a thought. You know, don't forget there is technology that may be able to assist not just members, but also the public taking part. Number two, notwithstanding that, the concept of having a planning committee discussing things around the Harbour current district held at County Hall fills me with dread. I can't see many residents, if not councillors from that area, wanting to spend 90 minutes a round trip and then a 2-hour meeting. I think it needs to be local. The meetings need to be local, and basically both, well, certainly Wiltshire has gone that way. I think Durham's much more, I can't remember the geography of Durham so much, but they do seem to be holding quite a lot in County Hall. And thirdly, neighbourhood planning. Harbour has done a particularly good job, in fact, on promoting neighbourhood plans amongst the parishes. I think the number's up to 17 parishes now, it might even be higher. And that is local. I mean, that's local communities. Might take them a year or two, but local communities looking at planning issues, village design statements, all sorts of things, which I think, you know, we need to encompass that as part of the grand unitary side, is that we must still encourage parishes to do their local thing with guidelines and all the rest of it, but at least to keep them going. Thank you, Chairman.
Good points there. So the overall, I think, conclusion here is that, based on all the comments people have made, is to keep it local, and the more local, the better. You've got to have some economies, and you've got to have some things that are clearly best done at a strategic level. But in overall terms, local decision making is the priority. So, if nobody's got anything else to add on this, I suggest we break for lunch. Do you want an hour, or do you want to crack on at 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock? We'll aim for 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you.